Thank you everyone for joining this symposium. This is the first data science-driven value supply chain symposium co-hosted by Institute for Supply Chain Excellence and Innovation at Rady School of Management in UC San Diego and Halıcıoğlu Data Science Institute in UC San Diego. I am Hyodok Shin. I'm a faculty member at Rady School. First of all, I wish that everyone is safe and well under this pandemic. Now, at least we see the glimpse of the end of this long tunnel. Right? In this symposium, we will have keynote speeches, panel discussions, and fireside chat by the leading industry experts in the field of data science and supply chains. And the goal of this symposium is to grow and enhance the community in the field of data science, business analytics, and supply chains. And due to the accelerated trend in the digitization of supply chains from the pandemic, the collaboration between analytics and supply chains became even more important. And we hope that this symposium will be the stepping stone to foster the collaboration even more, and also help our students at UC San Diego to better understand the current and latest industry practices and opportunities. Now, with that, let's move on, and let me introduce the Dean of Rady School of Management and UC San Diego. Dean Ordonez will give a welcoming remark. Dean Ordonez.
The Rady HDSI collaboration of our business analytics and data science master's programs has elevated both programs, which allows us to offer our corporate partners a support on a full spectrum from data science to business analytics solutions. This pandemic has shown the incredible role that supply chain plays in our society and how data analytics truly advances the functional role of supply chain. Furthermore, we see how supply chain crosses each industry. So for instance, I'll spotlight how Rady's focus in healthcare connects to supply chain. One of our esteemed faculty members in health sciences, Dr. Tim Mackey, teaches a blockchain course focused on healthcare, which demonstrates an interconnection between supply chain, healthcare, and technology. In addition, as many of you know, San Diego is the largest military hub in the country, and the military depends on supply chain expertise. We are proud to announce that retired Rear Admiral John Polubchek, who recently completed his tenure as the head of logistics for the Navy and oversaw logistics on the White House COVID task force, has joined the Institute for Supply Chain Excellence and Innovation at the Rady School of Management. And one last example I'll focuses on cross-border activities. So with a global move towards Mexico and supply chain, we have launched what we are calling the Post-Globalization Movement Research Project to study the implications of this move in collaboration with our students and corporate partners. With Rady at the helm, these supply chain connections are furthering the educational and networking opportunities that we provide for our students, both undergrad and graduate students that are interested in supply chain. We take great pride in educating the next generation of supply chain leaders and are excited to collaborate across campus with departments such as HDSI. So thank you all, and thank you, Tom, for presenting today and all of our panelists.
Great, thank you, Dean Ordonez. Next, the founding director of the Halıcıoğlu Data Science Institute, Professor Rajesh Gupta, will give us another welcoming remark.
Thank you, Shen, for pulling this event together. Thank you, Dean Ordonez, for encouraging this engagement. Last year, in summer, we graduated our first class of undergraduates from data science majors, 75 students. And as I was looking at the data, we saw that the largest number of students, I think 30 or so, had taken elective courses in management school. And that sort of got us thinking that our students are telling us something as to where they want to go. And since then, we started a conversation with the Rady School on actually creating a pathway for our students. This year, there will be 250 students graduating. that these students can actually take advanced courses in a 4+1 5 degree program with combined bachelor's and master's program. I'm glad to see that that work is ramping up, and we should have something to present to the campuses as a new proposal. So as we build these relationships across the campus, one of the most heartwarming things to see is now our faculty beginning to put stakes on the ground in terms of the areas of research where we would make a difference. Now, supply chain and business analytics have been two areas which I see data science making very strong investments over time. I'm sure you remember the word is flat book by Tom Friedman several years ago, and in which he makes the point that the supply chain is the word synchronizer of commerce. I think that is more true today, even though the word has changed significantly than it ever was. And we are beginning to see that in our daily lives today. So this is perhaps the best time to talk about supply chain. And so I'm so glad that we are able to pull that together. Going forward, I do hope that there will be engagements with our partners, industry partners. I see you have Thermo Fisher is speaking later in the symposium today, and they're our latest partner in our industry license program. So hopefully in the years to come, not only do we have our academic enterprise working together, but I'd love to see our outreach, our engagements with our industry partners also coming together. So it is definitely my pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for pulling this together.
Great, thank you, Dean Gupta, and also again, thank you, Dean Ordonez and Dean Gupta for supporting this.
Let me just correct you on one thing. This promotion is undeserved. I am not a dean, and so I'm still just Rajesh Gupta. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Professor Gupta. Okay, thank you again, fully supporting us this symposium. And now let's move on to our first keynote speech. The keynote speaker will be Tom Linton, who was the former Chief Supply Chain Officer at Flex, and also he's the author of several books, including the book called The Digital Supply Chain Innovator, and he's also a board of advisor in the Institute for Supply Chain Excellence and Innovation. And Tom will talk about preparing for a post-global world. With that, Tom.
Thank you, Dr. Shin, and thank you the rest of the program for inviting me. It's just a wonderful thing to be able to do, and I appreciate all of you taking time to attend today. What I would like to do is kind of unwrap some of the comments that were just made about where we're headed in terms of what we believe is a post-global movement. I also want to kind of go into some of the fundamental things that I see happening that will be incorporated in a book that is coming out in October. Just to put in a little plug, I've got a second book coming out. This one's going to be entitled Flow, How the Best Supply Chains Thrive. And really, it's going to look at some of the physics and some of the underlying things. And my co-author, Rob Hanfield, and I have done a lot of research into understanding how things move in the world and how things can be better done from the way the supply chains currently operate. If you look at supply chains in general, they've been operating since the beginning of time, but really only became a profession really in the early 1980s. And the term supply chain is kind of an evolving function. Unlike finance and unlike law and things like that, which have been around and have disciplined processes around everything from certification to like passing the bar exam or going on even into medicine to become a doctor or become a CPA in finance. Supply chain is an evolving profession. It's very amoeba-like, and it's entering a period right now where it's starting to actually find its feet. And we all know through COVID-19 what the world has gone through just in terms of understanding the dynamics of supply chain management, just how deep it is and how important it is to understand its various components and how it can be better done. And I think a lot of change is going to come out of this period. So I want to talk about 5 points. Some of you have heard me talk about these before, but I will try to refresh them in some new ways, updated ways. And the first point is this. We are, I believe, entering a post-global world. I first used that term in July 2019 when I was interviewed by The Economist magazine. They were doing a special on supply chain management entitled A Slow Unraveling. And what they were really going into was just how the world was starting to reshape itself. This was well before we even knew something like COVID-19, but it had to do with what was happening politically, economically, socially, and how the world was starting to reconfigure itself, driven primarily by the fact that costs have been equalizing around the world. And labor arbitrage, which was the major reason for supply chains to, for example, leave the United States and go to China, no longer have that strong pull because labor and wages have been climbing in other parts of the world where they have been not climbing as fast in the United States. So what you have is more of a equalization of costs around the world, and that's leading to something that my good friend Marshall Fisher at the Wharton School talked about in the Financial Times in October, that we have to actually rewrite our supply chains. We have to, everything we know, the textbooks that have been written, the work that's been done up to now really have to be rethought because so much is changing, both in terms of technology, in terms of the way that costs are changing, the ways that technology is driving things. There's a big shift underway right now in supply chain management. And sometimes I have to get people to kind of focus on the fundamentals in order to understand exactly what it is that we're dealing with in supply chains today. And first, I define supply chains, if you're talking about the physical supply chain, as material in motion. Material in motion is cash in motion. It's a 3-word definition, but basically if you're a supply chain person, you're trying to move things from one point to another. You're trying to actually get them through manufacturing, through to a customer. And it doesn't matter whether it's in finished goods or it's in raw material. It's all about material in motion. And if you're looking at it from a financial standpoint, it really is cash in motion because material has just been cash substituted, because now it's part of the balance sheet of a company if you're in business. And actually the movement of that material has a big drive on the balance sheet of the company. So it comes down to the fact that then you get into the physical part of the fact that time and distance do matter when you talk about supply chain management. And I talked about this a little bit in more detail in the book in 2016 called The Living Supply Chain, the Evolving Imperative of Operating on Real Time, because what happens in supply chains is speed is advantage. The faster you do something, the better it is in terms of customer satisfaction. Your income statement improves because costs are moving quickly through the process. And your cash is better because you're not consuming all of your material up for longer periods of time. So therefore, in a set period of time, you're actually throwing cash. So cash, cost, revenue, customer sat actually come from speed. So that's why we put a cheetah on the cover of the book. So if you ever want to think about supply chain in one word, it's about time. It's about time. Supply chains are time. And so how do you actually leverage that time and compress it and do it better? You could do it the way Amazon does it. They subscribe to something called the flywheel effect, which really is to put those distribution centers everywhere near the customer so that when you're an Amazon Prime customer, you can get it in hours or at least a day if they have it in a distribution center near you. So it's about this whole idea of speed and the clock speed and the time of how things work. You could also say that it also means it's time and money, because when you go globalization means things are far away. So if you're ordering something from China and it's not already in the United States, for example, or in North America, it's going to take longer than if you buy it regionally or locally. For that reason, we think that there's a shift here going on from globalization towards regionalization. The second shift that I believe is happening is from visibility to transparency. And this is going to take a little while to kind of think through, because everybody talks about visibility in supply chains today. Where's my stuff? I can't see it. There's dozens of visibility tools out there, software tools that actually help companies see where their things are, whether it's on a boat or on a plane, whether it's in a factory, wherever it may be. Supply chains in the last really 10 years have built visibility as a #1 priority. But I think what's going to happen now is a shift from visibility to transparency. So transparency is different than visibility in the sense that if you're in a boat and you're out on a lake and you're looking at the bottom, your eyes are looking down at the bottom of that lake. That's visibility. You're trying to see down into the bottom of the lake. But in reality, what's happening is the sunlight is bouncing off the bottom of the lake and it's providing transparency because it's reflected back to you. So therefore, what's at the bottom of the lake is coming back at you. So that's what transparency is. And that's the same as the edge network. So if you think of all these devices in the world that are getting smarter with each generation of technology, your thermostat, your car, your home, your technology and your phone, all of these things are smarter with every version of that phone or that car or that home. And so in the cities, and so what's happening now is that edge network, that now soon to be 5G network, all of it's getting smarter. And what it does is it allows these digital tools now to map the unseen in new and competitive ways because it's coming back at you from these devices. The devices themselves have captive intelligence inside of them that are providing that back, reflected back to you. So visibility is then what you see into, and transparency is what you know out of. So it's this knowing part of transparency that's important. It also favors everything we're trying to do from a sustainability standpoint. Understanding whether there's labor violations in a factory, or are the time cards for somebody mining material in Africa, are they complying with labor laws? Are there environmental issues in terms of the provenance of the materials where they're coming from? So all these things also favor this shift from visibility to transparency, where it's coming to you rather than you trying to find it. This push versus pull data models, if you think of it from a data standpoint, in a multi-enterprise environment becomes important. You've got to have a way to take all this data, which is coming from thousands of different sources in a supply chain, and map that in an understanding so that you can actually pull that up and have a way to look at it. So that's why I think that data, and what Flex did with its Flex Pulse was to actually create the digital tools for issue identification. So this is like what a machine would see, right? A machine would see a picture of data this way. In this case, this just looks at items of inventory, for example, and it would say that the size of the box reflects the cost or the amount of money that's tied up in that particular product. So this is the bill of material of a product, and you can see that the aging of the inventory in green it's under 30 days old is good. Aging of inventory over 60 days is red, and therefore it's bad. And so what you see now is areas that you can go work on if you're a supply chain manager and you're trying to manage inventory, because now you can go work on the red and you don't have to worry about the green. So data, it provides a visualization. This is a pretty primitive visual view, but this is the way a machine would think about it. And this whole idea of trying to create ways to suppress the noise in data so that you can isolate the things that are really going wrong, and try to create an alert process where it notifies you of something going wrong is extremely important. And this is why what we're referring to here, oops, moving too quickly here, sensitive mouse. The idea here is to convert digital data into actionable insights. So at Flex, there's something called Flex Pulse. The idea really came from a hospital where you actually have a lot of nurses around a nursing station. And the thought was, well, how does a nursing station monitor so many patients? Well, they monitor the pulse of the patient. They're not actually trying to do everything all at once. So the way you monitor a supply chain is you look for things that are wrong. Like I said, red, for example, might be something to isolate in an inventory, the same way you would isolate, well, somebody's pulse is not working properly, and therefore an alarm goes off and you can go in and fix that problem, because supply chains are enormously complex things. Every product has thousands, sometimes hundreds, sometimes even dozens, depends on the product, but all kinds of layers of part numbers that go into things. And if you go down multiple layers, the complexity is enormous. So you really want to find out what's wrong with something, and you want to be able to do that in a way that you can actually make it actionable into some kind of person actually taking it and fixing it. The third thing that is going to be an imperative, because of this issue of all the data and all the information actually coming at you and trying to unlayer it and isolate it into what's wrong, is what I call a supply chain mapping imperative. A supply chain mapping imperative is, okay, I've got to understand if I take a product, let's take my mouse in my hand here, and I want to look at that bill of material. I not only want to know the parts themselves, but the material that's in those parts. I want to know where they're coming from, and I want to know whatever risks are coming at me from below, from beneath. Insurance companies refer to them as black swans. They are things like COVID-19, which come once every 100 years. But the problem is, we had 2008, we had a financial crisis once every 100 years. Neither of those were predicted before they happened. They were black swans or blue lobsters, 1 in a million. There are things that occur on a regular basis, but you never know they're coming. So the important part of mapping a supply chain is actually to de-risk it. And I believe it's table stakes for supply chain managers, because if they don't map their supply chains, not only in the first layer and the second layer, you could end up like in February when Apple said, we've got a problem in Wuhan, China. And in February of 2020, they became the canary in the coal mine by saying, we've got deep in our supply chain a problem. And then if you remember back in February, they changed their guidance because they saw they weren't able to produce the materials there in their supply chain, and therefore it impacted their financial performance, their market cap was impacted, and then we all know what happened in March and April. So this idea of actually understanding what's coming up from below, what a mapping is all about. And it's done by basically building the software and the tools and the intelligence that actually does the connections between the dots and the nodes in the supply chain. And it reveals to us all the things that we need to do to de-risk our supply chains. The other thing we need to do is de-risk our supply chains by, in a post-global way, by instead of having all our eggs in one basket in one geography, which many people found out to be the case in China, they're now looking at, I need dual geography, dual supplier, and dual factories. Now, dual geography means I want to be in 2 different geographies. I don't want to all be in Asia. I don't want to all be in the US. I want to be diversified geographically. If I can't be diversified geographically, I want to have 2 suppliers in the same geography or the same country. And if I can't do that, I want to have at least 2 factories in the same supplier in the same country. In other words, constantly looking at duality and trying to de-risk supply chains. The other thing that people are looking at is what's called DFX, or design for something, design for supply chain, design for materials, design for sustainability, where in the process of designing products, you're actually looking at your supply chain and making decisions related to it, rather than just ordering parts against a bill of material and then hoping for the best, because you can't see beyond the first layer of your supply chain. So this idea of the supply chains actually having a supply chain map is something that greater importance as we leave 2020 into 2021. And what this also points to is how supply chain maps are required in the sub-tier, because and I won't go into this more in detail because I see you've got Rana and Resolink actually speaking on this topic exclusively. But one of the things that alarms me is when you look at risk, most people focus on natural disasters and hurricanes and things that are massive disruptions that are on the nightly news or in the newspapers, or we pick it up on a Twitter or an Instagram feed. But when you look at the data, most of those things are really driven by human-made disasters. They're not reported by mainstream media, and things like number 1, I think in 2019, if you look at this slide, in 2018 and 2017, number 1 on the hit parade is factory fires. I mean, in third world countries, when you get second tier, third tier in a supply chain, things burn. Things that are far away, if you don't know about it, could really interrupt your supply chain, because all of a sudden you're not getting the materials you need. I thought it was notable last week, Ford actually said that they're probably going to produce 25% fewer cars just because of what's happened with the semiconductor industry. And that was brewing for a long time. And many industries have similar issues related to COVID-19, where some production might have been stalled for a while, therefore things weren't done. We heard about it with masks. We heard about it with medical supplies in China as it rippled through the supply chains in 2020. So big issues there. The fourth thing I want to touch on is the imperative of operating in real time. And this was really the subtopic in the first book on the living supply chain. But what's happening is the internet is really now just a utility. It's like electricity, it's like water, it's something that we expect. And I think we've got to figure out as governments, some governments around the world have actually taken a strong control over this situation like we do with utilities in the United States. But it's passing an important milestone because the internet, invented in the mid-1990s, right, is now 20, 25 years old, depending on how you measure it. And that's about the same length of time it took for the car to replace the horse. It's about the same amount of time it took airplanes to take off. How long it took for the telephone, telecommunications to take off. In other words, it's this period of time when you jump from one technology to another. And it's really just the same as cars and horses for us today. I think 2020, when we write the history 100 years from now, just like we did in writing about what happened after the car was invented in the late 1800s, and it wasn't until the early teens of the 1900s that the car replaced the horse fully around the world. I think 2020 is when we left the analog world behind. Look at us here, we're all digital. On this call, we left it behind, and everybody's now full speed on a digital future. So how do we build the digital tools? How do we use the cloud? How do we create a way to take all this data that's in multiple layers of the supply chain and export that up so that people, managers, can use it? I mean, we're not machine to machine yet. We're in a world where people have to make those decisions, but in the future, we could also build a way where a lot of those decisions, or at least the sub-level decisions, can be made by machines. We also have an expanding edge. The edge of this network, as I mentioned earlier, all these devices are getting smarter than the one before. So every generation, right now we're jumping from 4G to 5G. We've left 3G pretty much behind. Most phones today are 3G, 4G, cars are 5G, cities are going to be 5G. And it starts to change everything about how the internet actually can be used incredibly effectively. I was involved with a supply chain startup in the late 1990s trying to leverage the internet. And we had a lot of packet loss and a lot of latency and a lot of issues related to just data moving through the network. No longer an issue. It's becoming table stakes for what people need to be focused on. The speed by which information moves, the speed by which we understand it, the data coming at us from the cloud into our devices, into our phones, and into our laptops is changing the way supply chain managers need to operate in the world today. So the big question we have to ask ourselves is, where are we going to put humans in this? I think one of the bigger issues facing supply chain managers in the next 10 years is, what are humans going to do versus what the machine is going to do? If the machine can start to do just about everything inside supply chain applications, talking to applications, lead time, talking to MOQ, all kinds of costs layering themselves and figuring themselves out through algorithms that are going to be written. We have to figure out a way by how we think about this. There's human behaviors and human aspects of this that we have to dig into when we think about supply chains of the future and how we monitor them and how we work on them in the future. But all of this really means that we've got to figure out a way to use advanced automation technologies such as AI and data analytics to automate the gathering, collecting, assessment, and use of supply chain data so that we can lower the cost and improve resilience in these supply chains. We got to put together this process of digitally mapping every company, every product, every piece of material in the world, like the DNA or a genome, like 23andMe, right? I think they're in San Diego now that I think about it. But how do we figure out this DNA of the supply chain? And how do we create a way by which this genome of part numbers actually comes together in a much more efficient and better way? And that's what create a great leap forward in how products are developed and how they're costed out. So I won't go into this one again because I think Rana is going to go into that slide probably a little bit more. And my last point is really what I think, and again, I'm looking at this from an American standpoint, but you could say our destiny, our European destiny. I'm talking about our Pan-American destiny, because what happens is supply chains regionalize and they pull back from globalized. Again, globalization was triggered by labor arbitrage. Good news, hundreds of millions of people came out of poverty as a result. But when you look at how supply chains move and how they're starting to evolve, just on the phone call, just literally 30 minutes before this one, a CEO of a product technology company wanting to assess how can he move some of his products out of China into other parts of the world. I mean, it is a major thing that's ongoing. Most product companies are having conversations along those lines. So as we look at this, we have to think about, and this kind of, again, goes back to the book that I have with Rob Hanfield coming out in October, how do we focus on the flows of supply chain versus the friction of supply chain? I mean, supply chains either have friction in them caused by times disruption or process problems or quality problems or production issues, whatever it may be. But how do we do that? We focus on proximity. We try to reestablish ecosystems that might have been broken. I think there's a tremendous opportunity between the US, Mexico, and Canada. I see that as an enormously powerful trade opportunity. It's global warming. Hey, people say Canada's going to be, like the southern United States in 50 years anyway. So we might as well start to figure out how to use our friends to the north. And then, of course, Mexico right now is a huge opportunity for companies that are moving out of other regions of the world to try to get to the markets closer to the point of consumption in the United States. Fulfillment in Mexico is a big deal right now for pharma companies, big deal for automotive companies, and a lot of high tech. So we're going to see a lot of this kind of reestablishing ecosystems that might have been lost. That's going to happen naturally, just pull and pull of cost. And we're going to see this start to, I think, drive massive gains in economic advancement for both Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And so to do that, companies need to think about how do they ring fence their companies with their strategic suppliers. I was an executive in a Korean company 10, 12 years ago, and we were moving to Mexico, but we had a lot of the Korean suppliers moving to Mexico with the manufacturing of appliances in Mexico. In the same way, I can envision a future where a lot of Chinese companies might be moving into the United States to satisfy the US market, and a lot of US companies might be moving into China to satisfy the China market, and the same in Europe. A lot of movement between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. A lot of these reconfigurations based upon how things get made because costs have neutralized. And then finally, the world is virtually vertically integrated. Vertical integration, you think about the Industrial Revolution all the way up through the 1970s and 80s. Companies had their, if you were making cars, you made the tires, you made the engines, you made the transmissions, you made everything you had to do in that car. Same is true with computers. You were vertically integrated. I worked for IBM. They were vertically integrated back in, if you go back into the 80s and 90s. That's not the case anymore. Outsourcing has changed that. We are virtually vertically integrated. And what are the connection points between these vertical integrated supply chains, and how do they work? Apple has no factories. Amazon has no factories. Microsoft has no factories. Facebook has no factories. They're virtually vertically integrated. And I think this whole destiny of how these supply chains work, both virtually, from a data analytics standpoint, supply chain standpoint, and also from a geographic standpoint, are going to dramatically change all of our futures. And I think it'll be a wonderful test to see that. I want to close with one quote. It's one that I think I like to go back and use history now and then. And this one came out at me, and I think it's a good way to start to think of AI and what I would like to call the autonomous supply chain. The autonomous supply chain is a supply chain that operates without a lot of human involvement, and actually, different applications and nodes, communicate with each other in the same way that an autonomous car might operate. But this is not the physical, this is actually the digital part of a supply chain. And how do we think about it differently? And King Solomon, in 600 BC, said, "The locusts have no king, yet all of them march in rank." So you think about that. Example from the natural world, locusts, they all go in swarms. Look at the birds in the sky, they all move together. Nobody's telling them what to do. I think we have to figure out how supply chains can move, how they can communicate with each other in such a way that we as leaders don't have to have control towers. We don't have to have processes. We don't have to have a lot of controls and orchestration of how things work, because they're organically, intelligently operating on their own. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you guys, and I just hope it is a great event in the beginning of many, many to come.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. But before you go, we actually have one question from the audience.
Yeah.
And the question is, what is your advice to small and medium-sized businesses to build a digital supply network?
Well, I think the first thing they have to do is understand their deep into their supply chain. Very few people, if you're buying parts, say, I'll just use an example, you buy a part from Qualcomm down the road or Intel. Very few companies actually know where the materials in those parts come from, where they're made, who's making them. You know, a lot of starting to look at the sustainability, which my friend, the Chief Procurement Officer of Bayer, put out, or they're looking at the UN Global Compact on child labor. I mean, you know, human slavery. I think there's a lot of issues around making sure that the product that you're building, whatever it is, you have mapped it. And this is hard work. It's physical work. It's because it's not all digitally there yet. But I think consumers are going to expect it. You know, when you buy a bottle of water or you buy a piece of food, you turn it over, it's got a barcode on the back, and that barcode tells you where it came from. You know, what artesian well did that water come from? What factory produced it? And I think the same thing is, as I said earlier, about DNA of our supply chains. I think we have to think in terms of data and DNA and part numbers and deep understandings of things, so that, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if we're a few years away from, you walk up to you want to buy a new refrigerator and you got a QV code, you go up there and you QR code, and you go up there and you scan it, and it tells you the entire supply chain of everything inside that refrigerator. I think these are the kinds of things that are going to be transformational. If you're a product company and you're building something, you got to think, you know, three-dimensionally, not just two-dimensionally about your product.
Great. Thank you, Tom. We have just one quick, another question. And this question is kind of interesting. The question is, how can we deal with this? So the question is, we can keep these multi-tier supply chain. How can we keep these multi-tier supply chain from being, let's say, these multi-tier supply chain being evil, right? So how can we deal with that sort of a complexity in the multi-tier supply chain so that it won't become evil?
Very good question. I do some work with you know, Generation Fund. They're a really good investment community of people that are looking at sustainable, you know, the circular economy and how things, you know, how you build things that are recyclable, repurposable, how you make sure that, you know, labor and everything is compliant. I think going back to my point on transparency, I think, you know, I mean, we can put devices inside containers and trucks that tell us whether there's any human beings inside that shouldn't be there. We can do that. That's easy to do. It's called asset tracking. You can have thermal monitors put inside vehicles, or I mean, there are things you can do with. There's the privacy laws issue, and then there's the, you know, the legal issues. But then there's also technology, and I think technology now can solve a lot of problems. It's a question of, can we figure out how to use that technology in the right ways to do, as you say, don't do evil, do good, and to do it in such a way that is compliant and doesn't invade, you know, the privacy and the integrity of people and wherever they are in the world. I think it's going to be. I actually wish I was graduating from your program right now, because the next 20, 30 years is going to be unbelievable.
Great. Thank you, Tom. It is about time. It is about
time.
Exactly. One thing also that I really liked, one of Tom's analogy is, you know, things in motion that generates cash. So we really want to move fast, but at the same time, we cannot drive fast enough if it is a foggy day, right? So we first need to get the transparency first and then drive fast, right?
That's right.
Thank you again, Tom.
Thank you,
Great, thank you. With that, let's move on to our next panel discussion. And actually, Mark Messo from Europe will facilitate this panel discussion about Web 3.0 technology, what this means for business model disruptions, And Mark is a founder and technical partner and Transform Bio AG. And also Mark is our board of advisor in the Institute for Supply Chain Excellence and Innovation. With that, Mark.
Hi, Shin. Thank you very much for the introduction, and very much appreciate you inviting me and our list of panelists to come and join today. Tom couldn't have done a better job as a lead-in for our talk. I took down a number of key points that Tom brought up around autonomous supply chain, no control towers, no orchestration, and really the real challenge of, the tech is there, but how do you figure out how to use it and how to apply it? All of these are really, really important themes that hopefully through this panel discussion, some of those topics will come out. I'd like to say a few opening words, at least before introducing our panelists. Just to kick it off, a little bit about my background. I've set up several multi-billion-dollar supply chain services companies. And in the last, let's say 10 years, been really focused on driving transformation projects across industries like high-tech industry, industrial, and now most recently the pharma and med tech. I'm really, really proud to be part of ISEI, Shin and Jimmy Ancilsari, and to be also working and collaborating with many of the great supply chain leaders that are part of this group. So what I think makes ISEI special is the word I. It's the focus on the word innovation. And that's really why we're here today. I'm going to give some prefacing comments and think about several years ago when a cryptocurrency called Bitcoin hit the world stage. At that point in time, the world was really fascinated by the existence of this new digital currency that was actually not controlled by any country or any central bank. And what made Bitcoin possible was the underlying technology that many of you have heard of course, called blockchain. Not going to try and give elaborate explanations on what blockchain is, but most of you know it as decentralized ledger technology, DLT. Why is this relevant? Well, today, after many years, Bitcoin is becoming a global accepted currency. Today, I don't know if you follow the markets, which are going a little bit crazy, but market cap of Bitcoin is approaching $900 billion. And maybe some of you have followed the news regarding Tesla and their purchase of $1.5 billion worth of Bitcoin. And I say the word purchase because it's related to the word procure, related to the supply chain of money. And where did Tesla procure this? Did they buy it from a bank that's controlled by the US government, or did they buy it from a decentralized market? I think this is something really to think about, and we're being inundated with many, many examples today of a revolution that's standing right in front of us. And this revolution is going to see a transition that goes from centralized systems to decentralized ecosystems, from centralized markets to decentralized markets. And as Tom said, these key words, going from centralized control tower types of supply chains to decentralized types of orchestration. The implications of this are really, really big. As Tom mentioned, we're trying to drive time, and time can be improved when you take friction out of the system. So this idea of frictionless commerce, the idea of having broader access to financing, being able to take decisions a lot faster. And hey, could you imagine a world in the future where the CPO or a category manager is not making all those decisions, but maybe the community's making those decisions, all contributing to time. I'm going to say this is not a technical conversation so much, but just to say a few words about what characterizes Web 3.0. And it's the words open, trustless, and permissionless. And just so we can touch on what those words are, open really refers to open source software. The trustless means that networks govern who gets to participate without necessarily a third party governing that decision. And permissionless, meaning that buyers and suppliers can participate without necessarily an authorization from a governing body. quite a transformation that represents compared to where we are today with the traditional models. So today we've got these very distinguished panelists that are with us today, and I wanted to say thank you so much for dialing in Europe, where it's almost 10 o'clock at night, and Don is in Japan. I don't even know what time it is over there. But we're going to try and answer some questions today with the wisdom that comes from the panelists. So for example, the questions we're going to try and flesh out are, in what ways are these panelists using Web 3.0 technologies to disrupt value chains in their respective industries? What predictions do our panelists have for the future, and how will supply chains be impacted? And most importantly, to many of you listening on this call, is what advice do the panelists have for students and industry leaders to prepare for this future? In other words, what skills are important to obtain, or how, if you're an industry leader, what can you do in your organization to start to embrace this capability? All right, that's it for my preface. I'm going to take a few words and introduce some of our panelists that we have here today. And what I've specifically invited some of the people I'm most impressed with in terms of their practitioner level skill to implement and execute. As Tom said, the technology is there, but how are you going to apply it? And how can you effectively create the ecosystems of the future? The people that you have in front of you today as the panelists are the ones that are actually doing it, actually making it happen. So it's not just about skills of knowing the tech, it's knowing how to apply the tech and implement it in an ecosystem. Requires several disciplines and several capabilities that have to come together. Otherwise, success is very difficult. So to start with, maybe I'll introduce Bastien Don. I was very fortunate to meet Bastien, and who I see as really a visionary. And he's led the charge in Switzerland to introduce regulated exchanges for tokenized assets. And as I said, this is not an easy task, because it's requiring, adopting Web 3.0 technology, but also really working hard with the regulators to be able to adjust regulation for this new future. And Switzerland, as you might know, is really on the map when it comes to Crypto Valley and some of the leading adoption of these technologies around the world. Bastien will talk a little bit more about this, but I leave you with one thought. Can you imagine a world where you will procure assets like gold or maybe real estate using tokens in decentralized markets? Next is Paul Kohlhaas. Paul is a visionary also who's impressed me incredibly with his ability to take on and conquer huge challenges. Paul has leveraged Web 3.0 in ways which will revolutionize the supply chain of intellectual property. Of interest to many of you on the call who come from pharma or medtech world, Molecule.to is a company that Paul founded. And this company is enabling drug discovery and development by giving access to decentralized financing for molecule intellectual property. So I'll leave you with an imagine question that, imagine the ability that a decentralized community can procure a fractional stake of a molecule. It used to be that big drug companies could buy molecules and they're big ticket items. Now a decentralized community could buy a fraction of a molecule. Can you imagine a future where researchers can secure financing to commercialize their IP without the need of the big coffers of big pharma? Next, and certainly not least, Don Gosson. Don impressed on me an incredibly huge passion for analytics. In London, he set up a global analytics practice for NTT Data. I always know Don is acutely aware of the potential value that can be derived if it were possible to untrap data from organizational silos. And Tom talked a lot about this topic here, but can you imagine what could be possible if you could take data across the supply chain and leverage data like cost, quality, delivery, and contract terms with your supply chain partners? What level of optimization is possible with that access? Don co-founded the Ocean Protocol Foundation and launched Ocean together with another visionary named Trent McConaughey. This is a very successful token launch Now Don moved on to even bigger things as the CEO of Keynote. And Keynote, I really feel, has one of the world's strongest talent pools of Web 3.0 development capability. And with that introduction, I'm going to table the first question to the panelists. Welcome, everybody. And I'd ask you to feel free to augment my introduction with a few words on yourself, but also answering the following question. What is the power of Web 3.0, and how have you leveraged this in your particular ventures that you're embodying, that you're engaging in today? Maybe Bastian, since you've got the screen, you can start.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this exciting panel, and also thank you to UC San Diego for organizing this event and having me. Maybe to add to what Mark said, we are a startup based in Zug in Switzerland, and we're benefiting tremendously from the foundation Switzerland has and the embracing of new technologies, particularly in the canton of Zug. So we are active in multiple ways around blockchain consultancy and solution development. So in short, we bring blockchain to businesses. And that's also where we bring in our hands-on experience. As Mark said before, we are very familiar with the aspect of tokenization in the area of real estate and also other areas. I'm sure we'll touch on that. So coming back to your question, Mark, in general, I think we are in this disruptive movement from something we got used to. With that, I mean, we have a society where we trust silos, very big silos. Another keyword might be globalization. And it's about time we move away from these silos. And it's my view and vision and belief that blockchain will help us tremendously to move away from all the big silos we've created together in a way that it's more fair and more democratic for the participants. You mentioned the word communities before. That's where the power will be eventually. And again, the people part of these communities will be rewarded for their work. And I think on the bottom of that is blockchain technology. And I'm happy to go into a little bit more concrete examples, maybe a little bit later in the panel.
Thank you, Bastian. Don Gosson, please give us your perspective on Web 3.0 for your particular focus, and perhaps some words on how you think some of the traditional value chains can be disrupted by leveraging the Web 3.0 technology.
Sure. Please bear with me. It's almost 6 a.m., but happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Dr. Shin, everybody else on the esteemed panel. Yeah, so as Mark mentioned, my background is in data and analytics. I spent the majority of my career wrangling data into something that would make sense. Whether it was in, manufacturing and supply chains or banking, insurance, the problems are pretty consistent across the board. And that is, a lack of overall fidelity in provenance and data integrity. So, where the real advantage to Web3 technology, and this, again, it hits on one of the topics that Tom brought up, is it adds to or creates environments where transparency is basically ubiquitous. So what you have are these systems that are, obviously immutable, but are intended to also be ubiquitous, and provide a level of fidelity on transactional information that is very hard to accomplish in siloed or centralized systems. So what you end up having, and in an analytics sense, the most important thing or the real purpose of analytics is to bring the participants closer to all of the facts as they happen. That's sort of, if you're an analytics or a data expert, that's what you're trying to get at. That's what you're trying to distill through the analysis that you're performing. What are the facts? What do I need to know at any given point in time? So any system that is going to percolate those facts faster and more transparently is going to help in terms of how you respond to any specific event or any type of activity that's going on within your ecosystem. And this is, fundamental to supply chains for the exact reasons that, again, Tom was pointing out. You want to be able to de-risk these multi-tier structures to the point where you've got more seamless operations between all of the entities that are acting symbiotically within these ecosystems. So that, that's part of the power of this type of technology across any domain, but in particular as it relates to supply chains.
Fantastic, Don. That's really clear. I want to come back to you on kind of what specifically you or Kiko are doing to make that a reality today, because sometimes, we're at the edge of a revolution, and embracing these technologies and implementing them is, as Tom said, part of the real challenge. So I'll come back to you in a moment. Maybe turn it over to Paul for a quick introduction. Paul Kohlhaas from the CEO of Molecule.to. Also revolutionizing drug development and the access to decentralized finance. Paul, what words do you have on how you've kind of embraced Web 3.0, what that means for for the disruption happening that you're leading in the pharma world?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, Mark, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for everyone from the UCSD team for making this event possible. Quick background to me, so my background is in economics. I also studied in Switzerland, became very interested in pharma and biohacking during high school, actually. Discovered so I'm a person that's interested in systems and system design. And I realized very on that pharma is a very, very broken system. If you think at the ultimate value that it delivers to patients and how pharma works today, but it's one of those systems where many people feel it's too big to fix. And that's where blockchain technology and Web3 technologies get very interesting, because they have the potential to fundamentally redesign incentives from the bottom up and change systems bigger than we could ever imagine. And so in pharma specifically, the issues that we look at are that pharma today, pharmaceutical development is very monopolized. And there's bad incentive structures for collaboration across the industry. Data isn't shared. IP remains literally in what the industry referred to as walled gardens. And ultimately, because of those practices, patients suffer. We came at this problem and said, ultimately, we could have much better and diverse treatments today. So we could have better treatments, and at the same time, many scientists don't get the funding or the support that they need. They wither at the vine. And where Web3 technologies, in our opinion, really excel are in fundamentally redesigning incentive systems for people to engage and interact in a completely new way that was previously unimaginable. And actually, Mark, you said a really nice thing in the beginning, is that actually we're focusing on the supply chain of IP. So traditionally, blockchain in the medical field or even in the pharma field has really been tied to how do we ensure the drugs that are being produced today that we consume are safe, because there's a lot of fakes out in the market. And blockchain in that sense can provide a very powerful solution to track and trace our goods. But I find many of the supply chain solutions that people began thinking of, and this was in 2017, 2018, around Web3 and blockchain, I find them quite boring. And this isn't because supply chains are among the most fascinating topics out there, but applying blockchain to supply chain is actually quite a boring way to think about it, because mostly it then goes into how do we improve our supply chain? How do we make the existing system more efficient? And what's actually much more interesting to think is how do we redesign the system to not run into the issues that we have today in the first place? So at Molecule, what we decided to do is to go a level deeper and not think about how can we track and trace the drugs that we produce today, but how can we create systems that develop new drugs in collaborative fashions? And so we went quite a level deeper, and we asked, how does intellectual property come to fruition in the first place? And if you think about, I mean, pharma and biotech today, biotech is a very, very hyped, let's say, investment area, and has gained a lot of attention, partially due to COVID, but has just been on a rise over the past recent years. But you have to imagine, what do pharma and biotech companies fundamentally do? What is the core asset? The core asset that they have is IP, intellectual property, patents, large, vast patent portfolios. And on the other side, you have data. And so we asked us, and if actually this is an interesting thing. So pharma works as a pipeline business model where you you discover an asset very early on, and then you take it through this very long, almost like pharma IP supply chain, which you have drug discovery, you move it into preclinical studies, and you then move it into clinical studies once the FDA approves. And throughout each of these phases, you produce more data, and then you bring the drug to market. So pharma companies used to be completely vertically integrated, meaning that they did all of that entire IP supply chain. What's happened over the past 20 to 30 years is that supply chain has started disintegrating into an ecosystem of service providers. And pharma today buys most of its assets through M&A. And we came at this problem, and actually these M&A practices are continuously driving up the prices of pharmaceutical products that pharma companies ultimately bring to market. Because today a pharma company might buy 5 or 6 assets. Let's say 5 of those assets fail in the second or third stages of clinical trials. So they've wasted billions of dollars trying to test the assets that they bought, and then 1 of them succeeds. And ultimately, those costs are offset to consumers. So we came at this problem and asked ourselves, what if, instead of doing it as a chain, centralized within companies, what if this work was being done in a marketplace? And the fundamental thing in this marketplace is that we fractionalize ownership in IP, meaning you could have IP around a new therapeutic, which could be one patent, composition of matter patent, or it could be a bundle of patents that make up a new therapeutic. And then we bundle them and we fractionalize them, meaning you can now share ownership between many participants in a marketplace. So the university that developed it might hold 10% in it. You might have a couple of investors that could also be patients in the drug that also hold shares in it. And slowly you begin to decentralize ownership. And through that, you create entirely new incentive systems. And that's a long-winded answer to how we're applying Web3.
So no, it's fantastic. You really put some color around for everybody to understand what that means, because I think so often in supply chain we think of physical assets, and the new world, as you said, a lot of the highest value companies in the world are basically data vaults and IP vaults, and so those are you're really attacking the supply chain around those type of assets, and really like what you said about this. Managing the IP supply chain is about managing an ecosystem of service providers. So you're really operating in a highly decentralized context, but that you're bringing that network together in a cohesive way. You raised a topic about incentive systems. I'd like to maybe invite Don to comment on incentive systems and how you're designing the tools of the future that can help to untrap data and make it easier to leverage amongst the partners. There's friction in leveraging data. Why does that friction exist? and what are you doing to create the incentives and the mechanisms to free that up?
Sure. So I'll try and be brief because this is I think it's a pretty substantial topic.
A PhD course on this.
Anyway,
now,
it's
so.
grounded. What we're doing is grounded in agency theory, and basically we're tackling the disconnect that exists between ownership and control in these federated or disparate or trustless systems, whatever you want to call them. So you've got a principal and you've got an agent, and in these disparate or trustless environments, those actors aren't incentivized normally, or problems will arise when they're not incentivized to work cohesively. So what we're focused on, and what decentralized Web3 technology in particular is focused on, is in incentivizing those two actors, the principal and the agent, to work together for the benefit of the ecosystem. So that applies both in Paul's discrete case, where he's working with the IP side of drug manufacturing, but it also works in the more nebulous space of data and acquisition of data. So how do you incentivize certain actors that are holding on to an asset of value to other actors in the ecosystem? So what we're doing at Kiko, we're building software that basically focuses specifically on these exact type of problems. So for instance, we're working on a use case that's specific to supply chain, in particular to COVID drug distribution, where within the physical cold chain, you have an issue of maintaining a certain temperature, minus 75 degrees Celsius, for these mRNA derived vaccines, for instance. Now, what you have in this case is within the cold chain, the manufacturer itself is embedding their own temperature gauge devices. And then they send the shipment off to the freight forwarder, and the freight forwarder will oftentimes put their own devices on the shipment. And on, it gets daisy chained as each freight forwarder picks up the shipment and passes it on to the next freight forwarder. So we're actually working with an air cargo freight forwarder. And the problem, the acute problem that we're tackling is, can we actually leverage other participants' data recording, and in particular their temperature data recording within this ecosystem, so that this freight forwarder doesn't need to put their own devices on the shipment. This is a cost displacement mechanism. So basically what we're working on is actually working with the freight forwarder and the manufacturer of the drug themselves that are putting their temperature gauge devices on the products to access remotely the manufacturer's temperature gauge data, so that the freight forwarder can understand if there have been any problems in transit with the temperature of that shipment. Now, what we're also focused on, and this is more of a philosophical stance or an approach to what we're doing, is that we look at the world from a federated view, not a consolidated view. So we're actually focused on keeping the data where it is originated and leveraging Web3 technology, decentralized access control, and remote computation to access that data in situ, so that you're not actually moving data around and co-locating it in a honeypot that then becomes, an attack target for malicious actors. But this is the type of thing that that the technology that we're working with is starting to enable. And I recognize that we're right at time now, I think.
I mean, these topics, any one of these topics are massive, and I think we're really giving a flavor for some of the great potential here. I think what you talk about, compute to data, this change in the paradigm from having to aggregate data, grab it from all your partners and aggregate it in a data warehouse. You're you're offering solutions that can then offer compute against that data without without necessarily having to grab it and aggregate it. So that's
Exactly.
you know, a little bit about what Tom talked about, the edge, but also computing that's enabling. Listen, there's so many great topics that you brought up here around the topic of agency theory. I'd like to ask Bastian, you know, as we get into the kind of final minutes of this session, there are questions around what the students can do to prepare for this future and what companies can do to prepare for this future. Are there POCs? Are there skills they can take, capabilities they can build on? I look at Bastian as an unbelievably talented person who's able to merge disciplinary talents and not only the tech, but the ability to navigate with regulators and really move the needle. Bastian, could I just ask you, where do you see this going in terms of adoption of tokenized assets? At what point in time could a procurement leader say 50% of what I buy is going to be a tokenized asset? And how can they prepare for that future in terms of their skills and knowledge?
Yeah, I think it's a super important question, which every procurement leader should be asking himself. And in my point of view, it boils down to focus on facts. So there are a handful of companies out there who have a track record in their respective industries within the blockchain ecosystem, right? So you mentioned before Bitcoin a couple of years. To be a little bit more exact there, it's over 10 years now. This technology is not that new. And there are a handful of companies out there who actually achieved really significant milestones along the way. And you can call it pioneering or being visionary, but in the end, they executed using this new technology within, in my case, in real estate, in Don's case, in data, and in Paul's case, in IP, right? So it's quite easy, to be honest, to find these companies. There are press releases around, but more importantly, the cases are very well documented and usually very openly shared. You mentioned it in your introduction. So next to open source and technology, the whole progress is very well documented in a very open way, which also again underlines this new technology and the movement that is coming. And maybe if you allow me, in terms of the students, what they should do, I would highly suggest them to look into decentralized finance. It's a complete new financial system that is emerging right now. It started maybe 2 years ago. Right now, inside this system, there are around 40 billion in value. And this new financial system gives anybody all around the world access to financial services like loans, payment services, exchanges, derivative, and et cetera, et cetera. But you can interact with these new companies in a very easy way. You don't have to ask an advisor, your bank, and it will give you a better understanding what is happening. And I'm convinced that these protocols will move into the direction of supply chain, and with that any other market where there's a need to embrace communities and enforce them. So that would be my suggestion, and trying to keep it short. Yeah.
Thank you. Shin, if it's okay, I just posed the question really briefly to the other panelists, or do you want us to wrap up here?
I think we are a little bit short of time, Mark. So
okay.
Maybe can we? Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, we can wrap it up. No, I understand. I mean, we really touching the surface, barely even touching the surface on this topic. But as you can see, it's vast. This is the future. It's transformational. It's revolutionary. In fact, Tom's introduction was so appropriate, because all those topics that he brought up can be enabled or realized in this new world, and the team, the panelists you see here are really the ones who are making it happen. So the practitioners with real experience to implement, and that's a rare skills to be able to find in the industry. There's a lot of talk, but it's really difficult to implement. So I hope if I'm not sure if your audience, the viewers have any questions, or we'd like to just pass it on to the next presenter. But I thank all the panelists for joining this late in the evening.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. We have a few questions, but for the interest of time, we'll pass it to offline and we'll definitely get back to you. And thank you again, Mark, Don, Bastian, and Paul. I see that this is a really big topic. All I can say is we will invite you again for even longer time for the bigger discussions. Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Shin.
Thank you. Now let's move on.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sean McCrary. He is a director of supply chain analytics at Thermo Fisher Scientific. Sean is actually a trained biologist, worked over 15 years at Thermo Fisher Scientific. And recently, Sean worked on a project, interesting project about scaling up Thermo Fisher's COVID testing platforms by over 100x times. So with that, Sean.
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Dr. Shin, can you hear me? Good?
Yes, loud and clear.
Sweet. All right, so first off, am I sharing? I am not sharing yet. Now,
not yet.
The share button. All right, so
Great.
Good. You see it?
Yes, Sean, go
Okay,
ahead.
cool. So thank you guys. I mean, I'm listening to some of you guys, the panelists, and I'm not going to use those big of words. You guys are really smart. You guys have been studying this for a long time. I've been living this on a day-to-day basis. Like Dr. Shin alluded to, I studied biology. I learned the love of a system through learning how a cell works. And so through that interaction with science, and then realizing I didn't want to go the academic route, I ended up really kind of falling in love with manufacturing sciences. So I started at Invitrogen, which ended up being a Thermo Fisher company and brand. I worked through manufacturing. I did people management. I ended up doing site transformation work, leading the planning team at our Carlsbad office here in Southern California. And then now I'm in a global inventory optimization role is how I moved into the global sphere. And over the last 4 years, I've been lucky enough to lead a data analytics community that leads the supply chain and information and value add. Now, what I want to relate to you is not really a formula or if you think about what we've been hearing and the future, we see this bright horizon ahead of us. Oh, just one thing. I don't have a lot of words because I like pictures, so you'll see more pictures than words. This bright future ahead of us. We have so many things that we've been talking about, not only in this session, but automated factories, AI-driven supply chains, drone deliveries, sustainability initiatives where the recycling, the reverse supply chains, all those things set the stage for this bright future. And don't forget, at some point, jetpacks. We will have jetpacks. I'm telling you right now. But as somebody who comes in there where my executives see this bright future and they come to us with a, hey, look at all the cool things we can do. Have you heard about this technology? Have you heard about this blockchain? When I look at that, especially when we first started this initiative, this is what I see. This is what I was faced with. I see a data landscape that is a jungle. If you're stepping into your role for the first time in a lot of companies, even big companies, especially in the biotech area where, this is an acquisition game and it's a lot of little companies that have formed big companies. You have a lot of disjointed data. You have a ecosystem that is chaotic, and you are now expected to deliver on that bright future. So how do you do that? How do you not start pulling your hair out as you look at what's ahead of you? And you start thinking, well, what about my inventories? The cause and effect relationships between revenue and stocking locations in my my supply chain. it is so easy to get lost. You will pull your hair out. And you know, through years of learning, there were many sessions where we'd be sitting there chasing every single one of the opportunities that we could have done. But we have to remember something. What's the point? Like, why are we here? And one thing I want to get across before, you know, 3 points I really want to kind of hammer home with this discussion. And it's know why you're doing, what you're trying to accomplish and why. We can only exploit what we understand. And when the crisis hits, and it does hit, last year definitely proved this, leverage it to accelerate that vision. Okay, so I put this compass here really to ground you guys when you're thinking about developing out plans and how do you start from that jungle to the bright future ahead of you. We need to understand why we're doing this. What's the true north? And we're companies, right? Well, a lot of us are companies, and the supply chains we manage are for profit. So really at the end of the day, it's how do we make more money? And yes, which provides the benefits and services that we all benefit from. My company being an example of facilitating the massive increase in the ability to test everyone in the world for the COVID virus. Because we were able to, as a company, scale up our supply chains by 100x in these product portfolios, we were able to meet the needs the global community had to manage the response to this virus. But we need to know always, well, why are we doing this? You know, I would suggest that you keep your mind around a balanced metric. You should not be only motivated, especially if you dive into supply chains. If you talk to a planner, they'll talk to you about inventories. If you talk to a manufacturing person, they'll talk to you about productivity. If you talk to a finance person, they'll talk to you about revenue. You know, you name the function, they're talking about a silo. The supply chain, in order to effectively manage and balance strategy with, you know, returning shareholder value, is to own all that. So there's a great metric, ROCE. It's the revenue minus cost divided by inventory. You bring those values into focus, and you own all those, so you can make trade-off decisions. So your true north is actually the best choice for your supply chain. Or other state, just take a total cost approach. If you're functionally optimizing, it's not going to work because you're robbing from somebody, and you need to be able to make those full trade-offs. Also, keep the vision of the future in your mind. I mean, you sit there, you saw what is expected, and you've probably laid out roadmaps. It is easy to get lost in the details. Constantly remind yourself of why you're doing what you're doing and what that vision is. Because when you sit in a meeting and you have to make a decision in that meeting, or you're about to kick off a project, or you're about to, you know, respond to an email, every moment is an opportunity to take a step closer, make progress against that vision, or away from. If we're not united against that blueprint, that vision, you know, we have a tendency as human beings, also very smart human beings, to wander, because we're all trying to solve for that future. Another thing, so if we move away from grounding yourself in why you're doing the thing, also keep in mind how do we make our data work for us? There is a very appropriate framework called the Sinafin framework that I've been using to help me in a situation realize what I'm dealing with. So a lot of us have gone through this, especially if you've been working. You look at data as a data scientist, a data analyst. There are different areas of where you're at. The Sinafin network framework allows you to realize where you're at in that cycle. And then it prescribes what you should be doing to move it along. Ideally, we want simple data. We want simple solutions. So naturally, we'd want to move along area. So if I'm looking at chaos, chaos is, I don't even know what's going on. My data is all over the place. I can't really see where my inventories are. You have a hard time answering the question of what back orders are, sales orders. You can't build automation, even though you may think that's a cool thing and that's ultimately where you want to get to. You need to understand that data. First step is just making it visible. It's pretty straightforward. And if you actually think about it, there's a management principle that if you make it visible, that metric improves. You know, a case in point, at Thermo Fisher, we used to have a process by which, and some would argue it was waste, but daily leaders had to be on a call to talk about their back orders. And because those back orders were in daily focus, that number went down. We gave them no intelligence on why the back order was there, what regional things were happening, if there were spikes in orders, nothing. The number went down. Now we've removed that mechanism for other reasons. And on average, that back order number has raised. And so when it becomes out of sight, in a way, it becomes out of mind. So even just this step of bringing visibility, though it's not the sexy future here, it does bring results and it does pay for itself. The next thing, moving from where you now can see it, but you don't really know what caused that back order. You can see there's back order, but you don't know why. Experimentation, understanding. This is a step commonly skipped, and it took me a while to actually realize this. I need to understand cause and effect in order for me to take advantage of that. Moving from cause and effect, where I now understand it, in order for us to move from, what's complex into complicated, we need to understand that cause and effect. But once I know that, I can start automating things because I see this cause, I know this effect, and I can start connecting the dots. But we have humans we're working with here too. So just because you can say, hey, I know cause and effect, to a caveman, fire was probably magic. And as we get to some of these magical things we can start doing, you actually have to start socializing it as well. We need to bring that knowledge, that understanding of cause and effect into our common vernacular so that people trust autonomous systems where you can go lights out planning. You could turn on a system that manages your supply chain and can react to change because in and of itself, it has the intelligence because you've connected the dots on those cause and effect relationships. So the Sinofin network is very powerful, but then also, last but not least, quote here, never let a serious crisis go to waste. And what's meant there is just perfectly elucidated by what we went through with COVID. We grew our supply chain, as mentioned, by 100 times to support those things. What we used to do about 200,000 reactions a week, we're now at 30 million reactions a week, so even slightly higher than that. And so because of that scale up, it's been very beneficial for the organization, but we had to move from where we were siloed to integrated and quick. Even though we would say in that siloed state, we needed to integrate, there wasn't a will, there wasn't a burning platform. If you need to clear the jungle and you need to get it so you can build out the future, situations like this will always arise. What you choose to do in order to allow that event to allow you to keep moving forward is very critical. Don't let good crises go to waste. I'm not saying COVID was a good crisis, but you get my point. So as a refresher, we always know the point of what you are trying to accomplish and why. We can only exploit what we understand. So experimentation to move it along the Sinofin framework. And when that crisis hits, leverage it to accelerate your vision. So we can get to that future. We can get to that. It's going to take patience, reality checks along the way. And yes, there will be jetpacks. So with that, thank you guys for having me. And I don't know if we have time for questions since I got it right on the time.
Thank you very much, Sean. For questions, just for the interest of time, thank you so much again. You are right on time. For a few questions, maybe we'll just put it on the offline and we'll contact you for questions. Perfect. But again, thank you so much. I can't agree with you more on never let a crisis go to waste. Can't agree more on that, right? Great. Thank you so much, Sean. Next, let's move on. Our next will be a fire chat about food movements, in particular tackling food waste and insecurity with data science. And with this fire chat, Helen Wang, the founder of W Consulting Group and also a co-chairman of our board of advisory at Institute for Supply Chain Excellence and Innovation, will talk with Emily Ma, who is the head of Food for Good at Google. With that, Helen.
Thank you, Dr. Shane. I'm thrilled to have my dear friend Emily Ma joining us today. I got to know Emily very well when we worked at Google X, and she has been a source of inspiration for me. In the past few years, Emily has been working on a secret project with food industry. Details were not available for the public until the end of last year. Since then, the project has been featured by Fast Company and other online outlets. Emily, welcome and thank you for joining us today. Would you please say a few words about yourself?
Absolutely. Helen, it is an absolute pleasure to spend some time with you, and thank you to the organizers of this conference for incredibly engaging content. My name is Emily. I have been at Google for a little over 8 years now, most of it part of an organization called X. The mission of X is to build companies like Waymo that are worthy of standing alongside a company like Google. So under the Alphabet umbrella, we intend to build what we call moonshots, basically leaning heavily into breakthrough technologies that will propel us 10x, right? Not 10%, but how do we improve an entire industry or an entire ecosystem by 10 times? And when we think about trying to solve a problem 10x better, we have to let go of any paradigms of thinking that we had prior. And even if we get like 2x there, that's actually better than like 5% if we're aiming for 10%. So there's a really powerful sort of philosophy, I think, that, you know, Helen and I have both lived and breathed for a long time. And so I've worked on Waymo, on Loon, on Glass, and along the way, I was a mechanical engineer by training, but over time, I picked up a lot of other disciplines that are very important in innovation and in change. So lots more to discuss. I'm excited to discuss this topic with you, Helen.
Thank you, Emily. So I thought that before we start diving into Emily's story, I actually like to share. Let's see here. Okay. So I like to briefly explain how we define the global value supply chain system. It is a very complex, dynamic, and living system. So the first layer of this is the center triangle, which connects companies, businesses, and industry worldwide in continued chains from the bottom to the top, including raw material, components, sub-assembling, subsystems, integrators, and finally, the final product and services. So a lot of companies, almost every company that you can think of, they have a place within this system. The second layer includes connectors like logistics and transportations and service providers throughout the value supply chain system. The third layer is the largest triangle that describes the value creation from ideas to products and the supply chain integration from upstream to downstream. Together, the value supply chain system includes the flow of trade, creation of value, generation of data, and an end-to-end supply chain ecosystem. With this background, I'd like to begin by asking Emily a few questions. So if time allows, we will take some questions from the audience at the end. So the first question, so Emily, so tell us a little more about the project. What problem are you trying to solve? And why did you pick up that problem?
Helen, I love the framework that you provided because it actually directly applies to the field that we're looking at. And I think food supply chains are particularly interesting because not only do you have items that even the subcomponent level, the component level, you can think of like a carrot and then like carrot sticks and then shredded carrots. And then you can think of package of carrots. You can think of 5 cases of carrots and a pallet and then a container of carrots. Those carrots are also perishing as we speak, right? They're slowly starting to decay. And so you have time, a time dimension that is even more challenging than any other supply chain. And so I actually have been fascinated by supply chains for a very long time. And it was only about 5 years ago, I realized how inefficient the food supply chain is. Helen, I know you used to work at Apple, and I used to work in hardware. We would never settle for a supply chain where there is 40% loss. It's crazy, right? So, at the same time, you're looking at the world and you're saying, whoa, okay, so 40% loss in the supply chain, and yet there are 1 in 8 Americans who are food insecure. How is this possible? We actually have much more food than we need, right? And yet there are so many people who don't have access to food. It seems like a really incredible opportunity to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, right? Solve 2 really big problems. And ultimately, I think a lot of people in the world of hunger relief believe that it's a production problem, believe that we might not have enough food. The truth, it's not a production problem, it's a distribution problem. It's matching the supply and the demand with transportation. And again, that is a beautiful problem for a company like Google to tackle because we have the compute now, the big data, the computing power to actually solve those problems.
Yeah, well, that's amazing because I think within the value supply chain, the matching of the supply demand is almost never going away problem. That's almost like both an art and science, how do we make that happen? So it sounds like you're tackling 2 very big problems. One is food waste, and the other one is food insecurity, that people might not have food, while there's excess food somewhere else. So how exactly, it sounds very complex, right? And I'm wondering, like, how do you measure how big the problem it is?
Yeah. So the amazing thing is, in the last 10 years, I think this concept of food waste has really come to the forefront. So just to kind of frame it for everyone, Kroger and Walmart together lose $10 billion a year. Like they just write it off their balance sheet, right? Because of wasted food, right? They could feed an entire country with that much food. Not only is it an economic problem, though, it's also a social problem, as I mentioned earlier, with the number of people in the United States who are food insecure. It's also a massive environmental problem. The best way to reduce carbon emissions right now is actually to reduce food waste because it ends up in landfill and that generates methane gas. Yes, you might argue with me that you can recover some of that, but there is so much of it going to landfill that if we could solve it, if we can move it upstream just a little bit, right, we've actually solved a triple bottom line problem. So I'm really glad the speaker prior, Sean, mentioned the Sinafin model. Because of the complexity, we have to respect the complexity of the supply chain. And the only way you're going to solve a problem on the left side of that model is to interact with the system first and then watch what happens. If it's a simpler, complicated system, you can observe from the outside and analyze what's happening and then design a solution. So because it's complex, we'll talk about what it means to interact with the system and see what comes out of it before we iterate and design again.
I see. Wonderful. Actually, Sean's also reminded me, right? I mean, he reminded everybody that it's important to have a profitability. So, I mean, what you just described, basically, the revenue minus cost, right, equal to profit. And then we actually have a 40% cost incremental. And that's a huge opportunity for the industry, to fix that problem as well. So what resources is required to solve this problem?
A lot. A dear friend of mine and this nonprofit research group that is really the hub determined that we need to invest collectively as a country $140 billion over the next 10 years to hit the Sustainable Development Goal for the United States around food waste. We're trying to halve the food waste in the United States. That was the commitment. And so there's actually 3 things that need to happen in the next 10 years beyond that financial investment. I think when it comes to people, it's a mindset shift. I think a lot of individuals prior to us, the panelists have spoken about how do you deploy technology? I think the step before that is just how do you help people overcome the fear of sharing their data? The technology might be blockchain, the technology might be a data lake, but we have been trained for 100 years to think about competition as the best way to get to the outcome. In nature, that doesn't actually happen. In nature, if you look at a forest, it's been proven now after 100 years of leading to the theory that the strongest tree will grow. Trees actually share resources. The forest is actually very, very integrated. So we have to work with each other in a different way. The second thing is obviously technology. I think especially in the world of food, it is literally the least digitized industry like on the planet. Unlike e-commerce, unlike the pharmaceuticals, it is incredibly, incredibly far behind in terms of technology. So even the most basic, boring stuff, we have to help food organizations bring themselves up to speed. I think the final thing is data, right? As I started sort of looking into this space, there are existing data sets, there is an existing data pipeline, but most of the data that we need in the food industry doesn't already exist. Broadband issues in rural areas with farmers might be one, right? Cost is another, not just the cost of the hardware or the sensors, also the cost of time, right? You think about a farmer who spends 12 hours a day working from 4 a.m. to 4 p.m. I think the biggest fallacy of Silicon Valley right now is we think that we could give a farmer a great tool, but expect them to spend 1 additional hour a day, like basically gathering the data and doing whatever he needs to get the insights that he needs. So those 3 things are really, really important to consider in tackling these problems.
I see. So it sounds like the data exists somewhere, or at least information exists somewhere. And I think the challenges of how to collect them, how to utilize them, how to organize them, seems like a big challenge. So what role in your particular project that data play, assuming that you are able to acquire those data? And is data the barrier or more of an enabler to solve the problem?
So I think a lot of people get a little bit anxious when Google shows up and says, hey, let's talk about your data. I'm just going to put the elephant on the table and discuss it. The truth of the matter is I really, bottom of my heart, believe that data is an enabler. You think about supply chains, right? You have financial flows and you have physical flows. And I believe this was touched upon by another panelist already. What drives your financial decisions and what drives your physical logistics decisions? It's information. Right? Information can be in the form of something very granular, but information can also be a heuristic that you've stuck with for a very long time, right? If you don't have data per se, like in the form of 1s and 0s, it just might be intuition. So I actually believe that information is what is necessary to solve the physical flows and financial flows in the most optimal way. I also think it's really interesting that in the last couple of decades, you've seen, Helen, you've been part of these supply chains for a long time. Companies have become so incredibly vertically integrated. Like, look at Walmart or an Apple, they literally own everything up and down, right? And if they don't own it, they control it, right? The challenge is once you optimize that down to a T, then where is the next step change? Where's the next step change, right? At some point, we have to work a little differently together, right? At some point, I love the comment prior around federated resources, right? At some point, the next step change you're going to get in efficiency is going to come from working with your competitors, right? Or working with others in your ecosystem, upstream and downstream. And actually, that's where the data becomes really interesting. People have discussed data lakes, data warehouses. How do you create a data lake or a data warehouse, not only for the different departments in your own company, but with all the companies that are upstream, downstream, and next to yours, so that you could find ways to share information, share insights, and interact differently with each other.
Very interesting. I love your earlier analogy about the forces for nature, right? So sharing and actually working together instead of competing, very interesting. So was there an aha moment that actually helps you to tackle the complex problem?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I was driving through our agricultural areas here in California and saw all these grain silos, right? I think silos are excellent for food, right? You got to store them, right? But terrible for data. And I've thought a lot about why there are data silos, and it's not necessarily because people like don't want to share. Sometimes they just don't have a way to share. And behind the scenes, if you think about it right now, it's very, very binary, right? You're either going to keep your data private, right? Or you're going to put it out there on a research, you're going to open source everything, you're going to make everything public. And so there's no nuanced way for people to easily set permissions. I know people have discussed blockchain, but even then I think there's a lot of barriers. Like most people in the food world, again, not tech savvy, right? You talk even sticking numbers in the spreadsheet, that's like a stretch for some of them, right? Let alone write SQL queries, let alone stick things on a blockchain, right? Even if you make an application, do they have like a cell phone or like the technology, the hardware to actually access the app? And so I think when it comes to the aha for me, it's really how do we go to the user? How do we go to the user and how do we help them unsilo their data?
So what are the challenges to do this?
So many. I touched upon this a little earlier. There's a lot of reasons, and I'm happy to share the blog that we wrote about this as we learned how to work with some very big organizations in the space. It starts with the non-technical aspects. It really does start with people, right? And our mindsets. There's two big reasons why people don't share, especially if they're part of a big company. Number one, it's just mandates and beliefs, right? They believe that things should be held, private, or it's a sign of power. They have particular data sets at hand, even between, let's say, your human resources organization and your finance team, right? It's kind of amazing how there's so little sharing because it's a sign of power. The second thing is just fear. There are no data principles out there. There's ag data principles, but there are no food data sharing principles right now that are fully established across many different organizations. For me, I think as an example, we spent a couple of years, actually, too, with Kroger and Feeding America. Kroger, largest traditional grocer in the United States. Feeding America, largest hunger relief organization, network of organizations in the country. Kroger, 2,800 grocery stores across the country. Feeding America feeds 47 million Americans, 200 food banks, 60,000 pantries. They really actually wanted to share more information with each other, but they couldn't. Neither are tech companies. So we actually quietly stepped in behind the scenes and facilitated that conversation. They wanted to have a conversation around their data. And why? Because they were kind of at odds with each other because they had beliefs that weren't necessarily validated by evidence. So Kroger's like, you know what? The pantries are not picking up the food from our grocery stores frequent enough. And then, Feeding America's like, well, the Kroger grocery stores never put food out for us to pick up. But in the data patterns and in visualizing what was happening, like they were able to see that neither of those beliefs were true. And beyond that, in a flowchart, we were able to map, just as an example for them in the early days, food going through one food bank to about 45 pantries and what days the pickups were happening and not. They were realizing that because of the one-to-one relationship between a grocer and a pantry, that they were not getting as much food into the system downstream because the pickups weren't as often as they could be by just one pantry, the one-to-one match of the pantries. So that actually, the visualization, the flow diagram was what allowed them to then ideate, how could we solve for this differently? We had this heuristic for the longest time that you had to match one pantry with one grocery store to keep things simple. What happens if we have a network of 12 pantries and then 12 grocery stores, and every morning the pantry and the grocery store get matched based on who's available and what's available on each side, transportation or food, right? And so in the visualization, in the pattern seeking through the data, we actually start to be able to be curious and ideate together to find opportunities to collaborate very differently.
Wow. So it sounds like, if I were to summarize, actually the entire entire afternoon, the first 2 hours, we were talking about visibility, transparency. Now you add a visualization to it. That seems like a roadmap that for us to tell a better story. So do you actually believe data can tell story better than?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think as humans, I used to actually also study our human senses. 70% of our brains is dedicated to what we see, right? 20% to what we hear, and then 10% to the rest of our senses, something like that, close to that. So the more we can create maps and we can create visualizations, the quicker we can absorb information. And so, you know, when I shared with you the example of the flow charts as well as like time series of things, like we're able to ingest that information much more quickly than lots of numbers or even facts that are spoken. Another example that we've seen that I'm really excited about is, you know, behind the scenes, you know, Google has helped many people, hopefully, you know, navigate through traffic, right? So, you know, when you punch into your phone, hey, I need to get to UCSG today and it's 9 a.m. and am I going to run into traffic, right? Imagine if we could do that for, let's say, a food bank and, you know, the network of food banks and a network of grocery stores, right? We can run the multi-node problem. We solve the traveling salesman problem. Plus, we can solve the packing problem at the same time using a lot of compute. But the output should not look complicated. It should be literally a map of routes on a map, and then a manifest for everyone else, right? And routes for everyone else. And I think that's the power of visualization. I think that's the power of telling a story. And then that's also where you start to see, oh, wow, prior I was using, let's say, 10 drivers a day and like 25 trucks. I can now see how this plays out if I use only 5 drivers and 6 trucks.
Wonderful. So visualization seems like very powerful for us to make good decisions. Yes. We understand, you know, all the complex data behind it, and the story basically tells, you know, the executives that what's the best way and what's the best decision to solve those problems. So you've been working with, you know, those large organizations. I mean, from where I can see, you know, it's really hard, right, for them to trust each other as well as for them to trust Google. Yeah. So what have you done? What's the magic to make that trust happen?
Oh, there's no magic, just a lot of patience. Well, a little bit more detail. I think patience is first and foremost, right? I think it's really important, regardless of whether you're a technologist, a data science, a business person, to be unbelievably humble. First and foremost, right? The humility, you know, like we never talk about like what product could we build to basically like have the marketplace of all marketplaces. And you know, maybe that's going to happen, but I don't think that's ever the purpose. I think we all know that we can make a contribution. Big companies, small companies, established companies, new companies. And that has to be the first part of every conversation. I think for me with Feeding America and Kroger, they were selected for very specific reasons. They were explicit in their external facing mission. Feeding America, seeking to end hunger by 2030. I don't think they're quite going to make it, but like it is explicitly public in their mission that that's what they're trying to do. Right now, it's really bad right now because of COVID. Their lineups are like 2 to 3 times as long. Many more people are food insecure. Kroger actually, we sought them out specifically rather than other grocery partners because they basically said to the world, we are going to pin our executive compensation to a program called Zero Hunger, Zero Waste. They have very, very audacious targets to reach by 2025 around bringing hunger to zero in their communities, 2,800 communities, and reducing waste in their supply chain to as close to zero as possible. And so we chose them because they were already aligned in their respective ways of working and thinking about the world. And then it was coming together as as 3 legs of a stool to talk about what would we do together to try to tackle this problem in the next level.
Wow, beautiful, beautiful partnership and a huge commitment. What is your vision, Emily? What does success look like for you?
You know, I hope that by 2030, that whoever it is, however we do it, we do have a thriving data exchange for food information. The technology might be blockchain, the technology might be other things, but I see a world where a big company or small company is so easy to share your data around sustainability and food waste and food insecurity that you don't even blink, right? Hopefully it'll be automated by then, right? And then similarly, if you as a big corporation want to subscribe to academic data. You don't have to go to the academic researcher, call them up, be like, hey, could you like download an Excel spreadsheet and email it to me? Like they can automatically sign up. They can say, okay, you know, I'm this type of company, XYZ. Could you grant me permissions? It's a click of a button rather than like 10-step process, which is what's happening right now. It was such a struggle for me during COVID, Helen, because you know, I work with a lot of food banks. I work with a lot of retail grocers. I work with a lot of food companies, and all the people who are so well-meaning in the space, philanthropists, people with lots of money to give, literally went about all calling the same food banks and the same organizations to be like, hey, could you give us some data? We really want to like map all of the refrigeration in the country. Or, hey, could you send us some data about your constituents? And the food banks were already under so much duress that they didn't have time to do that. So, you know, they actually came to us and they said, could you be the central resource? Like, we don't want to be like sending emails back and forth and trying to figure out who's who and what permissions we should set. We just want a single place where we do this once, and then, you know, we want to be able to trust the system to kind of figure out who needs information and why. And I think that goes back to a lot of the conversation earlier in earlier panels about this very topic. Yeah, well, I do see Google is a perfect, you know, platform for all the food company and, you know, food banks working together. Any call for action for the audience today? Absolutely. Thank you again for spending some time. I think this supply chain topic is really, really interesting, and data is going to be an unbelievable unlock, I think, for supply chains moving forward. I have two very simple things to ask of you if you are interested in making a difference in food waste and food insecurity. Number one, I highly recommend you going to a website called refed.com. That's refed.com. They are the most well-known resource for food waste data across the country, and they have a really, really amazing dynamic interactive model that you could play with for every sector of the supply chain. They combined 50 different data sets, of which most are public, some are private, to really get to the numbers. Beyond the cause and the impact, they've also looked at 40 different solutions and calculated what the return looks like for the entire country if we were to invest in them. So go take a look at that and tell a friend about how bad food waste is in this country. I think the second thing, you know, knowing that there's a lot of you out there who are data scientists or interested in data, I come from a world, even before Google, where we aim to be very user-centric. Right? We're all excited about data. However, how do we reduce the friction for our user, whether it's a farmer, whether it's a chef in a kitchen, in getting us that data? When I think about the collection and the aggregation of data, it should be, like, in my mind, as frictionless as possible. So we try to insert ourselves into existing flows rather than forcing yet another process upon, you know, a chef who has already done 100 things on their shift that day. That's really, really important to me. Finally, we are likely, by the end of the year, we can get it up and running, be setting up a number of Kaggle competitions around data science. So you can reach me through LinkedIn if you want to participate. I'm very passionate about solving these two problems, so I'm excited to speak to you about them. Wonderful. Thank you, Emily. And you know, you mentioned about how important people, right, partnership, trust is. And if you want to hear more, you know, from Emily, I actually going to teach a class called Emotional Intelligence in Value Supply Chain next quarter at Rady. So, you know, if you're students, they're welcome to join us, and Emily will be my guest speakers as well. So, Dr. Shi, we have 1 more minute left. Do you have questions for Emily?
Great. Thank you, Emily and Helen again. Actually, I do have one quick question, which is, in terms of the food waste, Emily, you talked a lot about the producers, manufacturers, maybe retailers or restaurants and food services. But then another source of, I will say, the big source of waste comes also directly from us, right? Us as consumers. Do you have anything to sort of suggest or talk about on how to reduce the waste, let's say food waste, on the consumer's perspective?
Dr. Shin, thank you so much for that question. So to just quickly quantify it, consumers are responsible for something like 40 to 50%, depending on how you count it, of the food waste in this country. We chose to focus upstream mainly because we can do something with that food. We can move it downstream to people who need it or compost or whatnot. I would highly recommend a book called The Waste-Free Kitchen. It's written by Dana Gunders, who is also the executive director for ReFed, on everything that you can do in your kitchen to become as waste-free as possible. I have like 100 tips that I can share, but I'm going to hold off on that. The name of the book is called Waste-Free Kitchen, and given these COVID times, I'm sure all of us are in the kitchen more often than not.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily and Helen. It was a great and very interesting talk. Again, thank you so much again. Now let's move on. Our next speaker will be Dr. Mani Janakiram from Intel. And Dr. Janakiram is a senior director of global supply chain. And he will talk about Intel's AI-enabled digital supply chain. Mani?
Thank you, Dr. Shin. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So let me go full screen. Thank you very much for inviting me. Today, I have the pleasure of talking about Intel's AI-enabled digital supply chain. It's been interesting that several, summits and conferences in supply chain are gravitating towards how to leverage data, technology, AI, and digitization of many sorts is also enabling several things we're doing, particularly in a situation where we are right now with COVID, how we have information that can be leveraged, anticipatory kind of managing things is also critical. And before I jump into the AI-enabled supply chain, I just, I'm sure most of you know Intel, but want to give a quick, what Intel is all about. Our vision is a trusted performance leader to unleash the potential of data. Data, as you know, is going through an explosion phase. That's why the picture on the right side indicates, like how and where the different types of unstructured data, whether it is web, mobile, broadcast data, how we want to harness it to convert data to intelligence is where, we are focusing lately, unleashing the potential of data. We are no longer just a PC company, and that is the intent of what we are looking at. And there are a lot of challenges for us. As you know, Intel has been in the news for various reasons, and but we are focusing singularly on how do we provide the best service to the customer, how do we understand the market and grow with the market, and how do we ensure that our products and technology is meeting the needs of our customer. And the supply chain organization, what we call as the global supply chain within Intel, is foundational to making the Intel vision come true. And with that, our supply chain is spread all over the world, and it is not, in terms of SKU and all, it is not as big as Amazon or the likes of Walmart. But in terms of complexity and scale and the reach, it is pretty huge. And there are some numbers here, and I'm just posting it so that you have a feel for our spends, like $35 billion spends, CapEx of $15 billion, $1 million, like orders all over, like 3,600, a lot of technical supply chain folks. So wide reach, wide scope, huge complexity are some of the things we are addressing. I'm sorry, there was a question. Okay, and we talk about why AI now, and there are multiple reasons for it. AI has been, leveraged, and it has been in the industry for 30 plus years. But when we start looking at why now, primarily, as you can see, the compute has become so cheaper. Ability to harness different types of data, the memory ability has enhanced, and analytics has grown multifold. When you put this all together with the communication protocol and everything, we are actually in what the Industry 4.0 calls as the cyber physical systems. And that is one of the reasons why AI is finding a lot of foothold. And of course, not to mention ability of our people, the talent is also growing along with it. And I kind of listed some of the things here, like the Gartner Hype Cycle, as well as disruptive innovation by Clayton Christensen. But the whole idea here is when you do this right, you will see improvement across the board, whether it is velocity, whether it is resilience, whether it is cost, you name it. And that is the beauty with how we apply. And having said that, I've been talking about AI for a while, and initially it was supply chain digital transformation, advanced analytics, simulation modeling. And when we start putting it all together, a couple of years ago, I came up with, how do I explain the autonomous digital supply chain to start with my folks at Intel and then to the industry. And I kind of latched on this idea of the autonomous navigation system, because this is something everybody have seen, have lived with. I'm sure 15 years ago, or even going back a little bit, we are all, some of us maybe, not all of us, are used to, taking out a paper map from, you go to a new place, getting out of your airport, rent a car, and then they give you a paper map, right? And then you take it out and then you start looking at, where do I want to go? Where am I? I'm sure I'm lost multiple times, and so are the audiences here. Luckily, we moved away from it into an automated Siri, Google Maps and things of that nature, where it is, you cannot think of not having it now in your phones or in the navigation systems, right? I mean, it basically, you just punch it in or you speak to it, and next thing you know, it is basically taking over. It's telling you, make a left, make a right, go here, go there. Sometimes traffic, and primarily telling you, you might want to take an alternate path. And so it is so absorbing and adaptable that we cannot think of anything but using it. But where we are heading with the autonomous vehicles and with all data as a platform for doing everything, our data on wheels, very soon it is happening in some areas, but I would say a common adaptation of autonomous vehicles is where you don't have to primarily go feed anything to the system. The system is integrated. It knows you. The vehicle knows you. It knows where you're going. It takes you where you want to go. And you could, for all practical purposes, you'll be sitting in the passenger side of the car doing things that you want to be preparing and things like that. So that is the progression that we have seen, right? Now the question I kept asking was, if we can do this in the consumer world, how about we do this in the B2B world? Let us talk about supply chain. What is that we can do about it? And that's why on the right-hand side at the top, I have the picture of autonomous digital supply chain. But one of the things that I noticed immediately, I mean, I'm sure Tom Linton was talking about some of this as well, right? Visualization and things of that nature. But when you look at it, our supply chain has grown over the years. In fact, several years ago, the word supply chain was not even there. It was operational management. And then it became supply chain. And then it became very specialized function in sourcing, in procurement, in planning, and in delivery or logistics. And our systems and tools, our talents, enterprise, everything was catered to making those silos the best. So step number one is, if you really want to get to where, from where you are, and whether it is manual, automated to autonomous, you really have to think in combination, not in isolation. Think of it as a matrix versus a silo that is stitched together with a score model or things like that. When you start talking about it, then the connection starts to unravel. And then the other question is, do we have the right talent? Do we have the culture to adapt it? Do we have strategy to put this in place? And then what are the barriers to it? Do we have foundational data? Do we, do we understand our business? Is it a big leap for us to go from where we are? I think those are all the different challenges. Do we have a fabric that stitches it all together, right? And how do we change the, the mentality of a planner to think about, hey, you know what, whatever you're planning, there is a procurement function that will impact. It's almost like kind of bringing it all together in the form of a design for supply chain is how we are looking at it. And the way I'm looking at it is, when we do this right, when we make this journey, it is going to drive multitude improvements, like deliver on commitment, drive execution, increase customer obsession. And if definitely the culture has to evolve to address these competitive pressures. So with that, where we are in our journey is, we have made a lot of advances in leveraging technology, leveraging analytics, and putting in place a lot of AI. And in fact, we have
our own IoT solutions that we are leveraging. We have our autonomous vehicles that does, like the technology that's being developed. And we also have AI, right from hardware to software. But from a supply chain perspective, we're kind of looking at what are the things that we can bring together? Where are we right now? Where is a need for it? How do we put this all together in Lego pieces? And how do we improve the foundational data so that we can go to the next level of analytics and then take advantage of the AI and things like that? What I have here is some of the capabilities that I would like to share with you. And I just want to be very clear that it's a journey that we have taken, and we have long ways to go to get to the autonomous digital supply chain, but we're making progress, and we are making progress in areas that are critical for us. For example, some of the things that we talk about is visualization. And it is very important to know what is happening in our supply chain end to end. It is not only what is happening, it is also clarity around what is going to happen, how do we manage and model it, and what are the different things that we can learn from it. That's where we started out with the virtual factory supply network modeling, and we are moving towards a digital twin, so that we can not only use this kind of models for primarily scenario planning and strategic decision making to connecting to the data and operation systems, so that we can get to decision making in an autonomous fashion where we can make decisions. It does not mean we are going to displace our workforce. It is a matter of uplifting our workforce is how we're looking at it. The same thing with autonomous planning. And we have very complex algorithms. In fact, our planning and the whole analytics was recognized recently by Inform Settlement Award. And we have a lot of complexity in terms of event options that have to happen, and also the operation models that need to come together, as well as scheduling that has to happen. And also we have integrated machine learning into it to enable some of those decision-making. And I'll get to that detail as well. And then the other area where we addressed was, as I was indicating, we spent $35 billion and then $15 billion on, like all the capital, CapEx, and all the supply chain. And we write a lot of contracts. Some of the contracts could be 2 pages, some of them could be hundreds of pages. And it is very important to know how we, like when it comes to contract, how we, primarily execute, kind of writing the contract, they execute to closing it, and then sometimes auditing and things like that. It was very manual, and then we had some challenges. So we primarily leveraging natural language processing and RPA and machine learning. We were able to digitize the contract with intelligence, and I will share that as well. And as I mentioned, predictive visibility, it is not the visibility, but we are talking more about the predictive visibility, whether it is in our planning, whether it is in our warehouses. We are leveraging AI, ML, and IoT, and I will talk about that. I have a slide on each one of them. And the last one on this list of things, this list is not inclusive of several things we did in inventory, but the last one I'm talking about is from a sourcing perspective, supplier intelligence and proactive risk management using cognitive AI and ML, including some reinforcement learning, is what we have implemented. So with that, I think a couple of slides on each one of these pages. As you can see, this is we have a vast network of supply chain. We do a lot of factory modeling. We do a network modeling. We do product decision tree analysis. And the whole idea here is, can we identify what the challenges are in our system? Can we optimize our supply network? Can we manage various scenarios before, so that we can plan properly, whether it is building a factory, whether it is putting a warehouse, whether it is understanding the risks in supply chain so that we can optimize inventory versus service level. So those are the different types of models we have built. And we are now actually moving towards, as I indicated, towards a digital, or what we call as the asset twin and the process twin. The asset twin, we are looking at it for some of the capital equipments, which are hundreds of millions of dollars, particularly the lithography tools. We want to understand everything that happens inside and outside of the tool, and so that we can get better utilization, better rate efficiency out of those, and also tweak the equipment as we go. It's not tinkering, but primarily more like a process control. And that is where we are focusing on asset twins. And for the process twin, we're starting to look at our product supply chains. And I mentioned about our autonomous planning solution suite, and this is definitely one of the complex, analytical example that I can share. Hundreds of thousands of constraints, and it has to happen on a daily basis. That we have to run the optimizer. We have to look at our factory loading. Our millions of wafers that go through our factories. And primarily thousands of our planner's time that is going into it. As you can see, the data from a long-range planning to mid-range planning to execution, it all gets boiled down to the planning data staging. And then we look at our capacity, what we can do, where we can manufacture, what kind of tools and dedications, what's the process. Everything is put together to come up with the optimal scheduling and optimal planning. And then we also have to make sure that we report out in a way that is understood why we do what we do. And the whole idea is to ensure that it is, like anything we do is well understood and explained, so that the explanation part is where we are leveraging AI and primarily several tools around, CART and then, some of the decision tree models are some of the, tools that we use here. And our goal is we don't want to have planning that has to happen on a regular basis. We will learn from what has changed using the AI, and then plan autonomously what we need to change or how we want to, do the supply demand alignment. And I mentioned about contract analytics. This was one of the challenges we had in terms of when we write the contracts, and then when we're starting to look at it, sometimes it is difficult for us to pull from our enterprise systems to know exactly, do we have, what's the warranty look like, and are we preferred customer, and what is the indemnity? So do we even have any of this, audit functions? And what we did here was we primarily pulled all the contracts out of the contract enterprise system, and kind of creating a data lake of sorts. And then we have to do primarily a lot of RPAs need to be developed to do the pulling, and then we have to do primarily optical character recognition for some of the contracts that were not necessarily digitized. And then once we have that, how do we stage them? How do we categorize them? And writing an NLP to really understand what does it really mean? How do I audit it, right? So that is where we had our subject matter experts, our contract analysts, and our legal folks come together. And with that learning, we have developed this contract analytics, and also created a dashboard where they can actually look at the contract and look at all the different parameters that they need to be looking at. And if there is, like what you see on the top right is primarily the green dashboard. If it is red, then they can actually go click on it. That will tell them what it is and why it is outside of the norms of the acceptance. And then it will take you all the way to the basic contract so that they can actually read where it is happening. So this is something that we implemented in our innovation lab, and now it has taken off, and we are implementing it across Intel supply chain. And I mentioned about our predictive visibility. It started out as understanding what is happening inside our supply network, and then we kind of expanded it into fab, sort, assembly, as well as external supply chain. The whole idea here is, are we in control in terms of the products and services that we're providing within the based on our definition, or if there is going to be a inventory challenge or a supplier challenge that's going to happen, maybe a days of inventory or things like that, we would like to know predictively that's going to happen before it happens. And this is where we are applying, a time series and machine learning kind of algorithms, and leveraging heat map contrast to look at thousands and tens of thousands of every component that we have to look at, whether it is tracking to our requirements or not. If not, what else can be done, and kind of feeding it into our control tower for better decision making is how we have developed this. And moving on to the next item in the list is primarily the sourcing intelligence. As I was indicating, this all started out as there are a lot of information out there on our suppliers on the market, and social responsibility, like a corporate social responsibility. And we also leverage it for pricing intelligence and also technology intelligence. And can we pull that information in a way, through web scraping and Twitter feed, and so that we can, whether it is paid, subscribed, or open source, we pull that together in a way so that we can answer the many facets of these questions that are listed here. Can we find new supplier? Can we detect potential physical financial disruptions? So kind of looking at it from a supply chain risk, and also looking at probably alternate supplier, alternate markets. And we are big on forced and bonded labor. So are our suppliers really handling things that the way like they should not be in the news for it? We also have translation so that we are not only just looking at English, but we're also looking at various other languages that feeds into a dashboard for our commodity managers, our supply chain executives, so that if there is anything that has to be brought to attention, they does show. And then, for example, some of the supplier negotiations were impacted because of the information we're able to gather. And we are trying to connect this to our risk solution so that we have the intelligence that also feeds the risk platform. And kind of bringing it all together, why we do what we do is it is enabling our supply chain to be more nimble, resilient. And it also has, like very quantifiable benefits like velocity increase, improvement in inventory, productivity increases, and a lot of improvement in supply chain disruption. And this, we have a very quantifiable value. And so I kind of listed some of the things that the industry is recognizing us for what we are doing. And we are continuing to make this happen further. And the question in everybody's mind is, okay, we talked about all these things. How are we leveraging it in the current situation? Primarily, with all the disturbances around us with the COVID and everything. The way we look at it is whether it is a peacetime or a wartime, we have to have a robust, resilient supply chain. We need to be, our supply chain need to be ready for faster adoption. And it also be ready for embracing changes. And we have a very clearly defined metrics, what we call as the CQuartz, so that we can monitor and measure and control our supply chain to that. And we are embracing and leveraging the advanced systems to convert data to information to insight. And so we are also making sure that our talent is ready, culturally as well as from a learning perspective. And so I think, we are leveraging it in such a way that we are ready for it. And so that we have a predictable, transparent, and prepared supply chain. And that is one of the things that our analytics is working in tandem with supply chain and business and others to make it happen. So with that, I'm going to bring it to the end, and with a quote from our prior CEO, Andy Grove. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mani, for the interesting talk. Just for the interest of time, we'll just move on to the next. And if for any questions, we'll contact you offline. Thank you very much, Mani, for the engaging talk. Now, as the last part, thank you very much. Okay. Now, as the last part of this symposium, it will be a panel discussion about best practices, challenges, and opportunities for the strategic use of data analytics in the supply chains. And we have great 4 panelists here. Rena Rose, who is a Vice President of Operations and Customer Success at Rady Link. Thank you, Rena, for joining us. And Walter Charles, who is a Chief Procurement Officer at CSL Behring, and also our Board of Advisors in the Institute for Supply Chain Excellence and Innovation. Thank you, Walt, for joining. Also, Sean, who also spoke, he's a Director of Supply Chain Data Analytics at Thermo Fisher, and lastly, Casey, who is a Director of Logistics, Strategy, and Optimization at PECO. Thank you, Casey, for joining as well. So to begin the discussion here, the first question that I would like to pose is just the topic of this panel, which is what are the best practices or challenges and opportunities that you have experienced in let's say applying this data analytics in the domain of supply chain, right? Can we start with Rena?
Yeah, so some of the changes that have how data science have changed supply chain. So when I started in supply chain many years ago, we didn't have the data that we have access to now. We were always in a reactive phase. So now we're looking at using data to predict impact to supply chain. I mean, can you imagine taking like what we do at Resolink? You take 10 years of event watch history, you overlay it with your PO history, and now what you're looking at is you're looking to predict what the outcome may be from the next event. You can now show that every time there's a hurricane in a region, for example, the supplier said that they were not impacted at the time, but 5 months later, we saw prices go up, part shortages or capacity. And this is what we have already built, and our customers already started using it to stay ahead of the spread. One of the examples is, they use this to stay ahead of COVID-19. For example, when the pandemic started to spread across the globe, the looming lockdown and other social distancing measures put our customer supply chain at risk, as it did for everybody. And the predictive risk model was used to predict the path of the pandemic, including when the peak of COVID-19 cases would occur and the date when the company would expect COVID cases to start declining. So by being able to predict lockdowns in Japan, Malaysia, China, and the Philippines a week in advance, they could make critical adjustments to the supply chain and flex the flow of inventories ahead of such restrictions. So it's a great example of what we've done to use data to better manage our supply chain.
Great. Thank you very much, Rana, for sharing that. Next, let's, Walt, do you have anything to share?
Yeah, and in terms of best practices, and great, it was great listening to Manny at Intel talk about some of the technologies he's deploying to get after driving value in their supply chain. But I've listed a couple of what I think some of the best practices are that could be game changing. First is around big data analytics for bid data, right? For those that don't know, in procurement, roughly 70% of most companies' revenues go through a procurement kind of activity, which means that procurement is probably the next largest opportunity in all of business to drive value after revenues, right? So I believe, so if you can use big data analytics, if you can synthesize lots of supplier data, supplier inputs, and get to actionable insights in seconds using a big data analytics framework, you can actually drive a lot of value, and you can decrease cycle times, because I think right now the state of the art is really the state of the art. It's using Excel as the primary de facto standard for how we get after it. The second one is supplier discovery. In the area of finding suppliers, the one interesting thing about Industry 4.0 stuff is that lots of suppliers are disrupting almost every category that we've been historically buying in. And that means that if you can find the right population of suppliers, you can potentially drive their differentiated value to your business to drive better impact. So there are a couple of new AI-enabled web crawling technology frameworks out there, like Tealbook, for example, that are great at helping buyers in seconds find the right population of suppliers to get after stuff. Contracts 4.0, I'm not gonna harp on what Manny talked about. He was talking about a lot more granular things around contracting, but there's lots of cool stuff going on in the contract space. The output of most procurement teams is a paper document, which basically concretizes what you've agreed to with suppliers. And so basically there are lots of cool tools going on there. We actually, I had the privilege of inventing one called an enterprise procurement effectiveness platform. So there are lots of tools in the procurement space that actually talk about enhancing the performance from a efficiency perspective. But I'll tell you, if you've got billions of dollars, 1%, 2%, 3% on effectiveness can drive significant improvement in overall outcomes. And so I actually had to invent an effectiveness platform for how procurement should be looking at managing the thousands of transactions that an enterprise procurement team kind of gets through each year to drive better outcomes, better alignment with category strategies, and pull that stuff through. There's stuff out there called self-driving supply chain. Some of the stuff that Manny was kind of hinting at is now here. There's a company called Era, which is phenomenal at reimagining how the supply chain could be executed so that you didn't have the massive amount it takes to get after it. And so those are some of the things, and all of those things conspire to deliver somewhere between, at least the companies that I've had the privilege of leading, 150 to 299% increases in savings, one of the key metrics for procurement. So that's some ideas.
Great, thank you, Walt. The things that we couldn't do it in the past, I can see that now with the help of those technologies and analytics, now it comes to us in the real time and also in a very short point in time. That sounds really, really exciting. Sean?
Yeah, there's so many applications, and really your business need in the short term also will fund those future visions that you guys are setting up. So even tackling the little project here or there will have the return on investment that continually allows you to go down that journey, self-funding along the way. I think the one thing though, that when we study this theory and the idea of supply chain and data analytics, we keep forgetting we're dealing with people. And the people element is very important. It's like if you were in a dark room and you had to do a function in a dark room and all this stuff was happening, a lot of noise, you and some people are trying to accomplish something, and then you have this output and you look at it and you're like, this is horrible. And you want to improve that. So someone goes, hey, I have an idea. Let's turn on a light. Let's get some light in here so we can see what's happening, so we can improve some things. Okay, so guy engineer, data analyst in this case, comes in and goes, well, I don't have a great light, but here's a candle. They put a candle in the middle of the room and you finally see the room. The room is a mess. There is stuff hanging on the ground. You're tripping over things that have fallen. You're putting things together wrong. And you have one of three choices. And this is the people element. First person goes, oh my goodness. Okay, let's go clean that. Let's go fix that. And we start getting return on that investment of creating that little bit of light we can now see. The second person will actually go, wait a minute, that candle, I don't know about that. I've heard of these things called LED lights. And, we should really put those up in there because that corner over there is a little dark. The last person, unfortunately, will also just blow the candle out. They don't want to see that. And so when we're dealing with our leaders or people who actually have to make decisions off that data, there's a human element we need to be cognizant of. And it really does come from not only being able to see the story from the data, but having that relationship with those people who have to make those decisions. So just that's kind of my add-in into this little data science perspective there.
Great, thank you very much, Sean. I can see, although I cannot see Helen on the video, but I can see that Helen's smiling at this point. She was championing on people aspect of supply chains for a long time. I am sure even in this day and age of data analytics and data science, still people matters, right? So that is really great to hear that. Lastly, how about you, Casey?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for this opportunity and UCSD conducting this whole symposium. This is pretty cool. Data science is very close to my heart. I think Professor Shin, you're aware of it, and we partnered a lot of times on this type of chats before. So data science, especially in supply chain, we see a lot of opportunities, especially from Petco side. If there is one of the strong reasons why Petco is still doing fine, even in the post-pandemic and within pandemic times, is our ability to source data, put together the right story and come up with some alternative plans and survive. So supply chain, the three big problems today, right? So one is how to survive this pandemic. There are two areas where got strained because of the COVID, especially in the companies, is supply chain and technology, right? So surviving with this pandemic is a big thing, which data science helped us. So we use something called network optimization within Petco. I think some of you might have heard as like a digital twin, and it's like a mixed integer programming data science problem. It quickly gave us options on where to pivot, where to open new fulfillment centers, where to open an on-demand centers, and how we actually fulfill the demand fluctuations that are driven by COVID very effectively, right? So we're very fortunate. We have a strong data science team in the company, both on marketing side, supply chain side, and all other areas. So the network optimization is one big opportunity from data science. The second one is how to get to autonomous supply chain, right? I think Mani mentioned it multiple times on the call, and even Tom Hilton mentioned it. That's the holy grail, just like how we can move our supply chain from riding a horse type thing to a Tesla autonomous car, right? Technology is there. It's all about when to happen. It's not about how to make it happen. Like Sean mentioned, we don't need to have a focus on a big implementations. Focus on small chunks and how to make it autonomous, and eventually add to the roadmap of full-scale automation, right? Think of this, today demand signals are pretty cool area for a use case in supply chain, right? I mean, demand can be identified through the social feeds, the geography of a location of a store, and a whole bunch of things, which can only be enriched through data science. There is no other way, right? And imagine a time when a demand signal is generated, we can automatically cut a PO and make the whole supply planning autonomous, right? The data is available, systems are available. All we need to do is make the human thinking automated and put it in our transaction systems and make it happen, right? We're very fortunate, and we're making some progress on our company side towards that direction, and that's very futuristic and a cool thing to work on in the next 2 to 3 years for us on the data science field, and we are very excited. As far as the challenges are concerned, right? I mean, like Sean mentioned, at the end of the day, supply chain is people business. We need strong people, and we need to take care of the people, right? And data security and privacy, right? Those are really important topics to address, especially in this socially connected digital world. Even in supply chain, we need to have somebody who is ethically managing all the data coming, right? With big data, there's a lot of data available. We just want to make sure that we are following all those ethical practices and following the data privacy and data security. So those are biggest challenges, if you ask me. And other than that, it's a very promising area.
Great, thank you, KC. Indeed, I cannot agree with you more. Really, now it's from the beginning of the COVID, now it's literally over a year, right? I am sure that, again, I'm borrowing Sean's analogy. Last year, COVID came and then blew off the candle, right? And now here we are after 1 year. I am sure we've learned a lot. You've learned a lot in the field, in particular in the supply chain and with the help of data analytics. Let's talk a little bit about what we have learned in the past year from COVID and how we work, right? This time, can we start with you, Walt?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, I never thought in my career that I would ever have to look up and find out where my PPE was being floated from ever in my life. And COVID has taught me that for the first time ever. I actually got calls from very senior leaders in our business saying, where's my PPE and when is going to get to us so we can actually turn on manufacturing or get back into the clinic or get, so that was the first learning. The second learning had to do with, and we're still living with this, right? You're seeing a massive ramp up in some of the in the COVID manufacture, which fantastic. We've got vaccines coming. That's wonderful. But we're also in the life-saving business, and we're seeing that as those orders get increased and things get scarce, it's making it difficult for actually providing other life-saving medicines. And so there's this competition for a scarce supply only being made worse. And so the consequence might look like, which is kind of terrifying, the consequence might look like we will be maybe getting more people ready for vaccination for COVID, but they're going to increase deaths in cancer and influenza and other stuff because of scarcity driven by the COVID stuff, which is something we've got to figure out as, I think, an industry, how to influence senior leaders in government on how to take those very, very sensitive life versus life choices that are out there when you're dealing with a scarcity driven by a pandemic. So that's been a massive learning. And fortunately, our business has done reasonably well because actually flu, people said, I'm going to get vaccinated. So our flu business did really, really well. And so we had some tailwinds for flu. We absolutely are still grappling with, I think, getting more stuff, getting more plasma for our business. But I think disruption, the amount of disruption that we're dealing with is unprecedented in my lifetime and doing procurement stuff for 30 years plus. And so it's interesting now how to manage that is becoming a very, very prized thing. So those are some of the things we're seeing.
Great, thank you, Walt. Although what I saw in the beginning was this whole disruptions of the supply chains, but like Walter, like you said, I think at this point I will say this is more like the success of the supply chain, right? Even with the stopping of that scale of the disruption, still things work, things move, right? I think this is really people like you guys in the field doing the supply chain work so that it actually works, right? Great, thank you, Walt. With that, we'll go to Sean.
Yeah, two things that really, and it goes back to what I was saying in my talk. It's amazing how much you can move the needle, no matter how much logic, how much good business cases you had before when you have a crisis on hand, where the solutions that are and the money that flows, just for perspective, my company posted a 50% growth in revenue just because of our association with the test kits and now with the vaccine productions helping the Pfizers and the Modernas. So, the technologies and enabling all that science created a need in order to finally break all those silos. Before this, my team was very focused on just supply planning, and we were trying to make inroads into end-to-end supply chain. As soon as that, stay-at-home order came out, and we were on calls with prime ministers and country leaders trying to get these kits out on the globe, it became very clear that our business case was relevant. And so it was a fast acceleration on this conglomeration of data, centralizing the data. Now, also in this moment, this crisis, everybody had, at least in my company, you put a bunch of smart scientists, people, and you put a world crisis in front of them. They're all wanting to help and contribute and solve. So, and you couple that with the fact that my infrastructure for ERPs is 30 plus ERPs, where we're trying to tie all that together. You have 30 to 40 different solutions that good, smart people have put together to try and solve their one siloed issue to enable it. It does not help in the big picture. And so when one of the areas we saw the most success is where we could wrangle around some key principles and then get high level buy-in on, no, guys, you can't do your inventory report and you do your inventory report. We have an inventory single point of truth. And that we all agree, yes, maybe if it's wrong, we tweak it, but you don't go out and spin off another one. So that was huge because it actually gave us, instead of just a philosophical discussion around it, it became very real why one would want to do something like that. And so that was an advantage for us.
That is a great point, Sean. That actually reminds me, one of my colleagues' rule, he said it's always when things are really complicated and complex, you want to apply Jimi Hendrix rule, right? And he said, what is Jimi Hendrix rule? Jimi Hendrix rule is you want to stay as high as possible, as long as possible, right? It's a great point, Sean. With that, let's go to Casey.
Okay, so yeah, COVID taught us a lot. Honestly, we went through three interesting phases in the COVID time. Even we are going through, right? As a pet retailer, people, just like Walmarts of the world and all, how they got impacted with the customer hoarding of inventory, we saw the same thing, right? So when lockdown was first initiated, in the month of March, something like that, honestly, we didn't expect anything like this can even happen, right? This is an unprecedented thing. So we saw like a huge surge of customers coming to our stores and holding inventory, and honestly, we don't know how long that will survive, right? You can buy 2 months worth of inventory, 3 months, and then people start losing their jobs, and it's a classic case of bullwhip effect, that we get taught in the supply chain classes, right? And you can see in real, how that is happening right before your own eyes. So we saw a huge surge, and our demand planning team doesn't know how to react with it. Are we gonna buy more inventory and gonna put company out of business? Or we're a small cap, mid cap company. We are not like a trillions of dollars of valuation or something, right? So basically, we saw that surge, and then after a month and 2 months, it started dropping really fast. And luckily, one of the thing Petco did really well is investing in data science and investing in the omni-channel. We immediately kicked off a lot of omni-channel type things, right? You can do buy online, pick up in store. You can ship from store. You can do go directly to the store. E-com too, right? So those enabled us to slowly pick up wherever we lost revenues. Even though pet industry in general started rising after COVID, a lot of pet retailers, they're out of business in the first few months because they're not able to adapt to this omni shift, right? And then once we saw that dip, it's again the same question. Now our DCs are exceeding the capacity. We don't have enough space, right? And then the next question is, how do you survive? And luckily, with the omni adoption and with the pet adoption that picked up, we start seeing the rise again, and that rise is going to be becoming like a more permanent change for us, and that put Petco in a really good position. But think of it as how it should be, or how it will be, in a war room kind environment, right? In a supply chain, understanding end-to-end flow of supply chain and bringing people together, all people, looking at one source of truth and automating and stuff like that. That's a whole a new level of learning experience that we were experiencing, and obviously data helped us a lot to be more agile.
Great, thank you very much, Casey, again sharing what you have learned and what you have seen through COVID. And that also reminded me actually about Charles Darwin, right? It's especially when we see this big change, the one that survives is not the strongest, is not the most intelligent one, but it is the most responsive one that adapts fast, right? So, and definitely is another evidence of that, right? Thank you again, Casey, for sharing. And lastly, let's go to Rana.
Yeah, so, being at Resolink, we've been talking about managing your supply chain risk for the last 10 years, right? Be proactive. So despite numerous supply chain, issues that have inflicted, like by disasters over the last decades, we had the volcano eruption in Iceland, the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, the Thailand floods, Hurricane Maria and Harvey, but most companies still found themselves unprepared for COVID-19. But what COVID-19 did is what none of these other disasters could accomplish. It caused a widespread awakening to the vulnerabilities that are baked into our lean, cost-optimized supply chain. It brought a greater focus on the need for building supply chain resilient capabilities. So that's one of the things that COVID-19 did, is through the pandemic, our profession has actually been brought to the forefront urgent debate. You know, I mean, my 19-year-old thinks she's a supply chain expert because she hears the word so much, right? So every news channel is talking about supply chain. So everybody knows it, which is great if you're in this field now, because it's given us that visibility. So what we've been saying and what we continue to say is, the first step is to build an accurate, detailed, multi-tier supply chain. And the small minority of companies that have worked with Resolink that invested in mapping their supply chain network before the pandemic emerged were actually better prepared. They had better visibility into the structure of the supply chain. So instead of scrambling at the last minute, they have a lot of information at their fingertips. Within minutes of a disruption, they know exactly which suppliers, sites, parts, and products are at risk, which allows them to put themselves first in line to secure constrained inventory and capacity at alternate site. I'm not going to make it like it's easy. You got to put the data behind it. And yes, supply network mapping can be resource intensive and difficult. However, there's no way around it. And that's what COVID-19 has taught us. Companies have discovered the value of the mapping is greater than the cost and time it takes to do it while the bus is in motion. You don't put the wheels on while it's in motion. Do it ahead of time. So that's been really interesting for us to see from our side. So, yeah.
Great, thank you, Rena, for sharing. I have the same thing to share, Rena. This COVID-19 forced us everyone to work from home, and one advantage that I see work from home is now I do this. My daughter's right across the room, and she's only 9 years old. I don't think she knows exactly what supply chain means, but at least she talks about, hey, Daddy, how was the supply chain going? I was like, do you know what it means? That's at least I see one perk of work from home. And also, Rena, I agree with you on the point that the whole emphasis on let's say just in time, right? The lean operations. In the wake of this COVID, I see now people talking not only just, let's say, just in time operations, but you also have to realize just in case operations as well, right? So I think also one thing that Rana, you mentioned, which is this is not the first disaster or the catastrophe that we've been through. There were others, including those tsunamis and flooding and all that. But like you said, the lessons should be learned, but it's not necessarily the case that at least I observed in the industry. But I think this COVID was definitely the wake-up call. And I hope and I believe that it is the case that lessons here, at least I can hear from you guys too, that lessons were learned, right? So with that, as the last question, I am sure in the audience, there are lots of students, in particular in the business side, as well as in the data science side. If there are a few words that you can actually talk to our students about, be prepared. If you come to the industry, you will see this, or some recommendations to our students. Let's start with Sean.
It's not what the textbook says. I remember one of the first times we have a rotation program for operations graduates who come into our program, and they were doing a stint with us in planning. And we were getting into a conversation about the practicality of like the economic order quantity model. And we were going in a little bit of a back and forth where I said, we have done this evaluation and it doesn't work for us. Set aside why I said that, but
don't tell me.
Immediately went and for some reason had the presence of mind to bring their textbook with them and opened the chapter into the page and told us how the formula should work. And I took a moment, went on the whiteboard, showed them the formula, and I said, hey, where are we going to get carrying costs? You say this is really easy, it's a formula, but our finance team can't even agree on this. So where are we going to get it? Great, I love it. I love the concept and the idea of optimization, but your textbook will only train you to think in the right cause and effect type balance. You got to get into the real world and actually experience that. So I guess the advice there is get in the real world, start really grabbing it.
Absolutely, absolutely. We just covered economic order quantities last week. Now,
Nice.
boom.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sean. Can't agree more. Casey?
Yeah. A few things I would suggest, right? The advancement of data science and analytics is going at faster rate than anyone has even imagined. If you think about, I mean, it's all, most of the students are from B school. At the high level, what managers do, right? So they look at metrics, KPIs, key performance indicators, and they say if they're going well, they'll brag about it and and celebrate and all. If they're not going well, they say, okay, let's put a team together, let's figure it out, let's solve it, right? If you think about it, with the advancement of data analytics and data science, most of what I just said can be automatable. And human brain cannot look into all these data like millions of records, like how computer can do, right? So you can do your Lean Six Sigma projects or whatever. You don't even need like days or months to do it now. You can just put a simple dashboard, do a Pareto analysis on a millions of records across supply chain in a fraction of minutes to hours, right? I mean, and there are tools to do it. There's a democratization happening in the data science too. So the analytics is an important thing, and as far as possible, move more towards understanding advanced analytics that is there out there today. What you think as a traditional management might go away pretty soon. So it's gonna, the moment we talk about autonomous supply chain, it's gone. So adapt to this new world that is coming your way, because you guys have 30-40 plus years of career from now on. So adapt to the advanced analytics tools usage, understand what big data is, understand how to put together automation or optimization things, and how to solution develop as opposed to just traditional management. Traditional management still works. When it comes to people management, it is still important. We need to motivate people, drive big things and solve problems and all. Those are all really, really important. At the same time, there is a world out there that is getting automated, so just adopt to it.
Great, thank you, Casey. I can't agree more. Also, learn how to learn, right?
Yep.
That's great. Rana?
Yeah, I wish I could just say ditto on Casey and call it a day, but so data science actually is turning supply chain into a much more strategic, giving it that advantage, right? It's increasing visibility, allowing manufacturing to decrease product life cycle, working with marketing. So, future supply chain will get closer to gathering the right time with the right insight. To make real-time decision, and as Casey says, things are moving fast, and you've got to stay with that. Apply the real world. Once you get into the real world, as Sean was saying, yes, it is not like the textbook. You will be asked, to why did this happen? Where are we going to get the money to pay for this? And those situations do come, and be ready to adapt. But data is going to make that real world experience, I think, a lot more faster. It used to be, we would have to take days or weeks to analyze something. I'm seeing that it's happening minutes at times now. So you've got to stay on your feet.
Great. Thank you, Rana. No, Walt, this time the most difficult sort of question to you now, to students in one sentence for the short of time,
so
just one sentence.
Students, your job should be to go where the greatest opportunity to grow is. And I believe that's supply chain. Why? Because we got most of the people with more VPs, more SVPs, more AVPs, more directors, more senior directors. Why? Because there's more people in supply chain. So if you want to grow your career, go where you got more lily pads to jump to. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Walt. I choose the right person for that last message. Great. Thank you, Walt. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I would also, before we finish, I would also like to thank all the staff members who actually made this webinar possible. first of all, in Kyle's team in HDSI, Kyle, Sophia, and Eric, thank you. And also on the Rady side, Melanie, Alice, and Dan, thank you very much for helping us to make this happen. Thank you again. And also thank you everyone for joining this webinar. Kyle's team just posted a survey link. So if you have a few minutes in the end, please click that link and then finish the survey. That will help us a lot in terms of preparing the next event. With that, thank you everyone. Have a nice weekend.